Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Night Fear. I know many of you listen to these stories to help you fall asleep. So before you get settled in, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from. And if you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. The first house my wife and I rented was a modest two-story home in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by large oak trees and an overgrown yard. Built in the late 1950s, it had an old-fashioned charm, creaky wooden floors, a cozy attic, and a detached garage in the back. It wasn't exactly ancient, but it wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to encounter anything supernatural. Ghosts were the furthest thing from our minds, but soon after we moved in, strange things began to happen. It all started with our young Labrador mix, Buddy. Buddy would often curl up beside us in the living room, dozing peacefully, but every now and then, he'd wake with a sudden jolt. His ears would perk up, and he'd start growling softly at the hallway that led to the bedrooms. His gaze would shift slowly from the darkened hallway to the attic door, as if he were tracking something invisible. Once his eyes locked onto the attic, he'd stop growling, leap to his feet, and trot over to the door, sniffing at it like he was trying to find something hidden. This became a regular occurrence, and it left a creeping sense of unease between my wife and me. One evening, I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom when Buddy followed me in, his tail wagging. He was still too young to be trusted alone in the house, so I kept him close. As I finished up, Buddy padded out of the bathroom and headed toward the living room. I called after him, but he didn't return. I whistled the same two-note tune we always used to get his attention. To my surprise, the same two notes echoed back to me, louder and clearer than my own whistle. I assumed my wife, already in bed, had called him, so I went to ask her to keep him inside while I took him for one last walk. But when I entered the bedroom, she was sound asleep. Just then, I heard the back door slam shut. I hurried downstairs, puzzled, and found Buddy sitting calmly on the back porch. The door was locked, just as it should have been. I didn't say anything to my wife, but over the next few weeks, it happened again. Buddy on the back step, the door locked behind him each time. While these events were the most noticeable, I often felt like something else was in the house with us. It wasn't malevolent, but there was an unmistakable weight to the air, an angry, bitter energy that lingered, making everything feel slightly off, like we weren't entirely alone. Then, about a month and a half after we moved in, our landlord, Dr. Henderson, called. He wanted to meet with us, saying he had something to discuss. We had never met him in person before, so we assumed it was about the upkeep of the house. He and his wife came over the next weekend. During their visit, Dr. Henderson told us the story of how he came to own the house. The original owner, a woman named Betty, had grown up in a small town in the Midwest during the 1930s. When she was young, she became pregnant out of wedlock, a scandal that caused her to leave home and move to a quiet part of Virginia. Betty worked for a local government office, but she never married and kept to herself. She gave birth to twins but put them up for adoption immediately. From then on, she lived alone in the house, surrounded only by her prized German shepherds, which explained the large kennel in the backyard. She had no close family or friends, just her dogs to keep her company. Dr. Henderson, a veterinarian, had met Betty through her work with the dogs. One day she called him with a request. She had been diagnosed with terminal cancer and couldn't afford both her medical bills and the mortgage. In exchange for taking over the payments, she offered him the house. He agreed, and Betty moved into hospice care, passing away soon after. The house was left to him. After her death, Betty's grown-up twins, who had been searching for her through updated adoption records, tracked her down. They learned of her passing and that her ashes had been donated to a medical college after her body was used for science. The twins wanted to visit the house and scatter her ashes on the property, which seemed like a simple enough request. Although we were hesitant, they assured us it would be done outside. We agreed, and on the designated Saturday, we left the house to give them some privacy. When we returned that evening, we noticed a small tree had been planted near the house, with Betty's ashes buried beneath it. The moment we stepped inside, the atmosphere felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. The strange, heavy presence that had lingered was gone, and Buddy never again seemed fixated on the attic door. It seemed that Betty had found peace at last. But within days, Buddy, now a little older, did something strange. He tore up the tree, chewing through its roots and knocking it over. We couldn't explain it. Whether it was his playful nature or something else, we'll never know. But Betty was no longer in the house, and for the first time, it truly felt like just a house again. It was a sweltering Saturday morning in late spring, right around the end of my 6th grade year in 1994. I was 12 at the time, just a kid, and like most kids, I didn't give much thought to anything unusual. But what happened that morning stayed with me for years to come. I woke up much earlier than usual, without any reason I could figure out. The sun hadn't even risen yet, and I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't. Once I'm awake, there's no going back. Not wanting to disturb my younger brother, who I shared a room with at the time, I slipped out and headed into the living room. It was quiet, too quiet, but I didn't mind. I grabbed the remote, flipped through the channels, and settled into my favorite spot, right in front of the TV, on the old beanbag chair we kept there. I loved sitting close, no matter how many times my mom warned me that I'd ruin my eyes. Everything was peaceful until the phone started ringing. I jumped up, expecting to grab the cordless phone from its usual spot on the counter between the kitchen and living room, but it wasn't there. I froze, listening, trying to pinpoint the sound. It was coming from down the hall, where the bedrooms were. Curious, I walked down the hall, my feet softly padding against the cool wooden floor. As I passed the bathroom, I realized the rain was coming from inside. My mom was the only one awake, taking a shower. Maybe she'd left the phone in there. Thinking I'd help, I reached for the bathroom door. That's when something grabbed me. A cold hand closed around my throat, and I was lifted off the ground. My toes barely touched the carpet as a thick, green mist wrapped around me, choking the air from my lungs. Panic surged through me, and I clawed at my neck, gasping for breath. My vision started to go dark, and in that moment, I thought, I'm too young to die. What is this thing? Just as suddenly as it had started, it let go. I fell hard onto the floor, gasping for air, still clutching my throat. I couldn't understand what had just happened. When I looked up, the green mist was already gone, dissipating like smoke in the air. I could hear my mom's voice from the bathroom, the sound of the water running. The phone had stopped ringing. I struggled to my feet and stumbled into the bathroom, sitting down on the toilet, trying to calm myself. My mom gave me a puzzled look, clearly wondering why I was so out of breath. Once she finished her call, I told her what had happened, but she didn't believe me. She brushed it off, said I must have been dreaming, and told me to go back to bed. I felt defeated, but I left the bathroom and went back to the living room, slumping back into my beanbag chair. I stared at the TV screen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Later, when my brother woke up, I told him about it, hoping he'd believe me. But he didn't. He thought I was making it up, even though he believed in ghosts. Years later, my brother started developing strange abilities. We found out that psychic sensitivity ran in our family. He became adept at using talking boards to communicate with spirits. One day, while we were preparing to reach out to our grandmother, I suggested we try contacting the spirit that had choked me. My brother was still skeptical about my story, but agreed to try. We reached our grandmother first, and then, almost like passing the phone to someone in the same room, the spirit shifted to us. It claimed to be an old friend of my father's, someone who had known me when I was young. He told us I had always been an insolent brat in his eyes, and the choking incident was his way of punishing me for being disrespectful to my father. He said I took him for granted, especially since my father had never had a father of his own. I was taken aback. How could I be sure this was really him? But then the spirit shared personal details that only my dad's childhood friend could have known. Stories about their friendship, things from their childhood, even the nickname they'd had for each other. Before he left, he passed on a message for my dad, recalling a specific event from their time growing up in a tough part of Dallas. When I told my dad about it, he was speechless. The event described by the spirit was something he and his friend had never shared with anyone. My dad was stunned at how much I knew about his friend. Things like his birthday, memories of their childhood. That was enough to convince both him and my brother that I hadn't been imagining it. My dad had always called his friend Flash, and that's why I call this story My Encounter with Flash. It wasn't too long ago that I think I may have brought something into my home, something I don't fully understand. I can't explain how or why it happened, but whatever it is, it's made one thing very clear. I'm not alone here. Let me give you a little background. I'm 21 years old, married, and I have a 1-year-old son. My husband and I moved into this townhouse in early 2021. We were excited about the fresh start, and it seemed perfect at the time. But now, less than a year later, I'm questioning whether we should even renew the lease. Our townhouse has 2 bedrooms and a full bath upstairs, with a living room, kitchen, and a half bath downstairs. When we first moved in, we were thrilled. It was much bigger than our last place, and the rent was nearly too good to be true. It felt like a dream. But from the start, I struggled to sleep. There was always this nagging feeling that something, or someone, else was here with me. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was just the newness of the place, or maybe the fact that it was bigger than what I was used to. But then, the strange things began to happen. At night, when we were downstairs, we hear noises from upstairs, footsteps, creaking, and faint sounds that we couldn't explain. When we were upstairs, we'd hear similar noises coming from downstairs. And then, one night, it started. I began to hear my name being called. It wasn't a whisper. It was as if someone was standing right behind me, calling out. It happened more than once, always when I was alone. One morning, I decided to take the day off work while my husband was still asleep. He works overnight shifts, so he usually sleeps during the day. I was in our son's room, picking up his toys, when I heard someone scream my name, loud and clear. I didn't hesitate. I rushed to our bedroom, thinking maybe my husband was awake, but he was still sound asleep. Confused, I thought maybe he'd been talking in his sleep, so I just let it go and went to the kitchen to make some coffee. That's when I saw it. Every single cabinet door in the kitchen was wide open. I stood there, frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. I hadn't opened them, and there was no one else in the house. The very next night, things took another turn. I was in the kitchen, trying to figure out what to make for dinner. My son had already fallen asleep, and the house was eerily quiet. As I moved around, I accidentally bumped my knee into one of the cabinet doors. I didn't think much of it, just closed the door and kept going. But a moment later, I ran into the same cabinet again. It was open. I knew I'd just closed it. Then, as I turned to put something away, I felt the door move, brushing against my legs. I spun around, and sure enough, it was open again. It didn't make sense. That night, I called a friend and asked her to come over. We sat in the living room, chatting and laughing, trying to distract myself from the growing unease. But suddenly, we heard it, organ music. It was faint, but it was there, like something from an old church organ. Then we heard the sound of children laughing outside. I stepped outside to check, but there were no children, no music, nothing. It was just a cold, empty street. Hours later, after my friend left, I heard loud stomping upstairs. My heart raced, and I immediately ran up to check on my son. But when I opened his door, everything was just as it should be. He was asleep, the lights were off, and the door was locked. There was no one else upstairs. The activity didn't stop. Doors would open and close on their own. Radios would turn on by themselves. Once, while taking a shower, I glanced at the curtain and saw a shadowy figure standing just beyond it. I thought it was my husband, but when I called out, there was no response. When I pulled the curtain back, there was no one there. My husband swore he hadn't been upstairs. Another time, while I was carrying laundry upstairs, I felt a hard shove from behind. I was lucky I was going up, not down, or I might have fallen. 2 nights ago, things finally reached their breaking point. A storm was raging outside, and I decided to unwind with candles and music. Then the phone rang, but when I answered, There was no one on the other end. Moments later, there was a knock at the door. Expecting it to be a friend, I went to answer it, but no one was there. I turned on all the lights downstairs, blew out the candles, and decided to go upstairs to grab a book. When I returned, the entire house was pitch black. Every light I just turned on was out. Another knock came at the door. I ran upstairs to the window, but despite hearing the knock, no one was there. That night, so terrified, I woke my son, packed a bag, and headed to a friend's house until my husband came home. I don't feel like this presence wants to harm me, but there are moments when I'm truly scared. I can't explain what's happening in this house, but I can only hope that whatever it is, it has no ill intentions. About 20 years ago, I moved in with a friend I'll call Emily. Her husband had just taken a job in Arizona, leaving Emily behind in our small town in Oregon to sell their house. I was in between living situations and needed a place to stay, and she didn't want to be alone, so it seemed like a perfect fit, for a while, at least. The house was old, built sometime in the early 1900s. It had belonged to a woman named Margaret, who had passed away some time before, though I'm not sure if she died in the house. Still, the moment you walked through the front door, you could feel something lingering. Emily and I were both aware of it, the presence that seemed to cling to the walls, heavy and unexplained. Margaret's family had sold the house quickly, leaving many of her belongings behind in the attic and scattered throughout the rooms. When I first saw the house, it looked abandoned. Vines twisted up the walls, shrubs grew wild along the edges, and the windows were boarded up. It seemed like no one had lived there in years, but after weeks of cleaning and repairs, the house began to reveal its beauty, the old woodwork, the intricate crown moldings, and the high ceilings. There was charm beneath the dust. But despite all the work, there was something unsettling about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. At first, everything seemed normal. I worked during the day, and Emily worked nights, so our schedules didn't overlap much. But then I started noticing little things. Every afternoon when I returned home, the antique dining room chairs were pulled far out from the table, as if someone had been sitting there. I pushed them back in, only to find them moved again the next day. It didn't make sense, just the two of us lived there. I asked Emily if she'd been moving them, but she said no. We didn't even use that table. We always ate in the smaller kitchenette. There was also the statue. It sat on a small shelf built into the half wall between the dining room and the living room. It was a strange piece, chalky white, of a rearing horse, a man, and a dog. The statue's eyes had been gouged out, leaving dark, empty sockets that gave it an eerie, unsettling appearance. It was dusty and fragile, and Emily warned me not to touch it. She said it might fall apart. But one day, we noticed that the statue had turned completely around, now facing the living room instead of the dining room. Emily asked if I'd moved it, but I hadn't. The dust around it was undisturbed, as though it hadn't been touched in years. I felt an odd curiosity and lightly brushed my fingers over the statue. A few flakes of chalky dust crumbled off, but there wasn't even a trace of dust anywhere else. It didn't make sense. Then there was the doll. Emily called her Elizabeth. She was another thing left behind by Margaret, and she terrified me. The doll was old, with human hair, tiny glass teeth, and eyes that seemed too alive. Her skin was dark and wrinkled, almost like dried leather, and even her fingers had little, realistic fingernails. She sat in a small high chair in the corner of the room, and sometimes the chair would shift positions on its own. Neither Emily nor I ever touched her. I couldn't even look at her for long without feeling a cold chill run down my spine. Things got worse after that. The doorbell began ringing in the middle of the night, even though no one was ever there. One night, a large, heavy mirror in the master bedroom crashed to the floor, though it had been securely hung, and no one had been near it. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, especially when I was alone in the house. It was as if something was always just behind me, waiting. The sensation grew stronger every night, making me feel so uneasy that I started avoiding being home alone as much as I could. Finally, after a few weeks, the house sold, and I couldn't have been happier to leave. I never drove past it again, even though it's just a few streets away from where I live now. There's something about that house, something that still lingers in the back of my mind. I don't know if it was the house itself or something Margaret left behind, but I'm glad to be rid of it. Two years ago, my family received the devastating news that my grandfather had been diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. By the time doctors discovered it, the cancer had already spread, and there was little hope for recovery. Though my grandfather and I weren't very close, only seeing each other once or twice a year, there was always that unspoken family bond between us. When we learned of his diagnosis, we made a conscious effort to visit him more often, even with our busy schedules. Sadly, despite all the medical treatments, nothing could stop the cancer. Over the course of almost a year, we watched as his health rapidly declined. Each time we visited, he looked more fragile, more diminished. The last time I saw him was in November 2000 at the hospice care center in a small town outside of Silver Springs. I stood beside his bed, watching as he stared into the distance. His eyes were empty, as if his spirit had already left him. He didn't speak, his gaze unfocused and hollow. I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something about that moment wasn't right. It felt as though the man I knew was no longer there. A priest entered the room to offer prayers for the dying, speaking of death and rebirth, as my grandfather had been devoutly Catholic. Though I wasn't religious myself, I joined in the prayers out of respect for him, as did the rest of our family. When we left the hospice that day, I couldn't forget the look in his eyes. It stayed with me like a cold shadow following me everywhere I went. A few nights later, I came home from work around 11:30 p.m. and immediately went to check my emails. As I typed a response, something strange happened. Without any reason, I stood up and began singing Amazing Grace. I'd heard the song plenty of times, but I had never learned the lyrics. That night, though, I sang every word with perfect clarity, as if it had been imprinted on my mind. The clock on my computer showed it was 11:55 p.m. when I finished. At first, I didn't think much of it. I went back to typing my email, as if nothing had happened. But when I finished, the weight of what had just occurred hit me all at once. I realized that my grandfather had probably passed away. I rushed to my sister's room to tell her what had happened. She believed me immediately, knowing I wasn't the kind of person to make up stories. As we talked, another strange event occurred. Her television turned on and off by itself several times, before finally going back to normal. She burst into tears, feeling the presence of our grandfather, and we held each other, both shaken by the strange occurrences. After she fell asleep, I went back to the computer room to write some more emails. While looking for a word in French, I reached for the dictionary on the desk. When I turned back to my computer, I noticed something odd. A small door on the left side of the desk had swung open to a 45-degree angle. Thinking it must have been unlatched, I closed it firmly. But when I turned back to the desk later, the door had opened again, to the exact same angle. This time, I knew it wasn't just a coincidence. Something, or someone, was trying to get my attention. The next morning, around 9 a.m., my mother woke me with some unexpected news. My grandmother had called from the hospice. The nurses had told her that my grandfather had passed away at 11:55 p.m. on November 15, 2000, the exact moment I had begun singing Amazing Grace. In the weeks following his death, we experienced more signs that he had not truly left us. My grandmother, especially, felt his presence in their home. For nearly a month, she would occasionally sense him nearby, as if he were just checking in. Even now, she says she feels his spirit from time to time. These moments serve as a reminder that those we love are never truly gone. Their presence lingers in ways we can't always explain, but it's comforting to know they're still watching over us. When I was around 10 years old, my family and I lived in an old farmhouse just outside Pine Lake, a quiet town nestled in the hills of upstate New York. The house was large and imposing, sitting on 5 acres of land, surrounded by dense woods and overgrown fields. The stone foundation was weathered, with ivy crawling up the sides, and the house itself looked like something out of an old ghost story. Its wooden exterior was darkened by age, and the large wraparound porch creaked with every gust of wind. Inside, the air always smelled faintly of dust and old leather, and the floors were made of thick, dark wood that groaned underfoot. There was a fireplace in every room, and the old brass chandeliers flickered when the wind howled through the trees outside. One particular night, I couldn't sleep and decided to get up for a drink. The kitchen, separated from the rest of the house by a small breakfast bar, was quiet. I poured myself a glass of juice from the fridge and glanced out toward the living room, hoping the cold glass would help me feel more at ease. As I did, I froze. In the dim light, I saw 3 figures moving through the living room. A man in the middle, dressed in a uniform that looked like something from the Civil War, dark, formal, and finely detailed. On either side of him, 2 women, dressed in old-fashioned, lace-trimmed gowns, each with their arms linked around his. The women's faces were painted with heavy makeup, and they looked out of place, as if they had stepped out of a time long past. They walked across the room, the light flickering as they passed, and then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they vanished into the far wall, where the entrance to the hallway was. My heart pounded in my chest, but curiosity pushed me forward. I rushed down the hall and into the living room, hoping they'd still be there. But the room was empty, silent, the same as it had always been. That night stayed with me, even after we moved away from the farmhouse. Years later, I decided to look into the history of the house, hoping to understand what I had seen. To my surprise, I discovered that many years before we had moved in, the house had been used as a tavern during Prohibition, a place where secret meetings and deals were made in the dead of night. It had been a hideout for a group of spies who passed information between New York City and Canada, and the layout of the house had been quite different back then. It explained why the figures I had seen walked through the wall. They were from a time when that part of the house didn't even exist. I'm not sure what I saw that night. I don't think they were ghosts in the traditional sense. To me, they felt like echoes, fragments of a long-forgotten moment, still lingering in the air. Maybe those 3 people had been celebrating something, or perhaps something tragic had happened, leaving an imprint on the house. Whatever it was, their story was replaying itself, a memory trapped in time, destined to be relived again and again. And now, the house waits, as silent as ever, for the next person to catch a glimpse of its haunted past. When I was around 15 years old, I'm 31 now, my best friend lived in a house that everyone in our small town believed was haunted. It was an old, creaky place at the edge of Pine Lake, nestled between tall trees and surrounded by a thick fog that seemed to linger year-round. The previous owners refused to talk about their time there, which made it all the more unsettling. There was always this uneasy vibe in the air, like something, or someone, was still lingering inside. Unexplainable things happened all the time. Lights flickered, dishes would inexplicably fly off the shelves, strange figures appeared in mirrors, shadows darted across the walls, footsteps echoed when no one was there, and doors slammed shut for no reason at all. It felt like something right out of a horror movie, only this was real, and it was happening to us. One afternoon, we came home after school and assumed my friend's mom was drying laundry because we heard the dryer running. But when we checked, no one had been home all day. That's the kind of thing that kept happening there. Small, eerie moments that didn't make sense and left you wondering if you were just imagining things, or if something else was going on. The scariest experience happened one evening while my friend and I were working out in his basement. The radio was on in the next room, playing softly in the background. Suddenly, the volume turned itself down. We assumed the radio was malfunctioning, so we got up and turned the dial back up. Just a few minutes later, the volume turned itself down again. It wasn't a digital radio with buttons. It had an old-fashioned dial you had to twist to adjust the volume. We tried to shake it off and went back to our workout, but then we heard it. Footsteps running across the floor upstairs, followed by a loud door slamming. A few seconds later, the footsteps moved to the floor above us, and another door slammed shut. We froze. Slowly, we made our way up the stairs, expecting to find someone, or something, but the house was completely empty. No one was there except for the two of us. When our workout ended, I headed home. My usual route took me through my friend's backyard, past some thick bushes, and out to the street. I hadn't even made it 300 feet down the road when something made me glance back. That's when I saw it. The back porch light of my friend's house was flickering on and off. At first, I thought it was just the old wiring they complained about all the time. But then the light stayed on, and a tall, dark figure appeared underneath it. I couldn't make out any features, just a shadowy form that seemed to emanate an unnatural menace. I kept walking, picking up my pace, but the moment I did, the figure started to move. It walked at first, then broke into a run, faster than any person could move. Terrified, I sprinted away, but the ground was slick from the evening dew, and I slipped, falling hard on the cold grass. I scrambled to my feet and kept running, feeling the thing gaining on me. I veered through a yard and jumped over a small stream, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally made it to my front door, I was shaking. The house was empty, but I didn't hesitate. I immediately called my friend. "Was that you?" I asked, my voice shaking, thinking it might have been him playing a prank. But he sounded confused. "What are you talking about?" "I've been here the whole time," he said. "The next night I was at a neighbor's house, working out, trying to avoid the strange happenings at my friend's place. This neighbor lived just a few houses away from the haunted house, so we figured it would be safer. But even then, we couldn't escape the strange occurrences. We heard a loud slam on the bulkhead door leading to the basement. A moment later, that same dark figure appeared, this time standing outside the basement window watching us. My neighbor didn't believe me when I told him about the night before, but when he saw the figure too, he didn't know what to think. Later, as I walked home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, and sure enough, there it was. Out of nowhere, my friend appeared from behind a house, running toward me. For a split second, I thought it was him playing another joke, but then I realized it wasn't him. The figure didn't move like a person. It was something else, something not human. I turned and sprinted in the opposite direction, hoping to lose it, but it chased me faster than before. It was relentless. When I finally reached my house, I slammed the door behind me, out of breath and terrified. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing: whatever that thing was, it didn't want me anywhere near that house. The next day, I retraced my steps through the snow to try and make sense of everything. My footprints were there, but the figure's prints. They vanished near the brook, only to reappear in the swamp, heading back toward my friend's house. I couldn't make sense of it, but I knew one thing for sure: that house was haunted. I haven't been back to that house since. My friend's parents split up, and they moved out of that place, but the stories linger. Even now, my friend's family insists that something dark lived in that house. I've had other strange experiences there, but nothing as terrifying as the night I encountered that shadow. Whatever it wasn't just in my mind. It was real. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. I was born and raised in the heart of Texas, but now I live just a couple of hours south of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Even though I'm no longer in my home state, the strange events I experienced back in Texas have stayed with me. Looking back, I think my first encounter with something beyond the ordinary happened when I was around 8 or 9 years old. It's hard to say for sure what I actually experienced, but I've never been able to shake it. It was Christmas Eve, and I remember lying in bed, wide awake, staring out the window. The house was eerily still. Everyone else was already asleep. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a thud on the roof, followed by what sounded like bells jingling. At that age, I assumed it was Santa Claus, though I never actually saw anything that could explain the sound. My family didn't hear anything, and to this day, I still wonder what it was that made that noise. Things got stranger when I started high school. During my freshman year, my mom, brother, and I moved into a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing too out of the ordinary, just a simple place. But from the moment we walked in, something about it felt off. The apartment had this strange, unsettling vibe. It was a small two-bedroom with a simple layout. A narrow hallway that led to the living room, dining area, and kitchen, and 2 rooms down another hall. My brother's room was the first on the left. Mine was at the end of the hall, and my mom's room was directly across from mine. One night, while everyone else was asleep, I was on the couch watching TV. I clearly heard my mom's bedroom door open, followed by the distinct creak of my own bedroom door. I waited for her to come in and check on me, but she never did. The sound lingered, and a cold chill ran through me as I realized something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling, so I decided to head to bed. After that, things settled for a while. But it didn't stop there. Another evening, I found myself home alone, just me and the quiet hum of the TV. Suddenly, it went silent. The movie stopped abruptly. I got up to check the TV, but before I could, the lights flickered out. I was sure they were on a timer or something, but I quickly realized the only way to turn them off was from the switch by the front door. My heart was racing. I panicked and ran out the back door, heading to a friend's apartment just down the hall. When I told her what had happened, she looked at me wide-eyed and said something similar had occurred to her the same night. We had no explanation for it. After my brother moved out, my mom and I moved to a downstairs apartment in the same building. The first year was quiet, but soon enough, things began to pick up again. The layout was the same as the upstairs apartment, but reversed. My new room had a large walk-in closet that always gave me the creeps for some reason I couldn't explain. One night, while sitting on the couch in the living room, I began to hear a faint creaking noise. It was coming from the old picture above me, a large, framed photo of a sailing ship. The sound was unmistakable, like a ship creaking in the water. I thought it was my imagination at first, but as I leaned closer, it became undeniable. The sound was clear. It unnerved me, and after that, I couldn't stand to have that picture in the room anymore. I had to take it down. Another strange incident occurred with an old handbell that sat on a wooden mount near the front door. It was a heavy bell, and I had never once heard it ring on its own. That is, until one evening while I was watching TV. Out of nowhere, I heard a sharp chime. My cat, who had been sleeping on the couch nearby, immediately perked up, staring in the direction of the bell. I looked, but there was nothing there, and no draft to explain how it had rung. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to get our attention. The incidents continued to grow more intense. One night, I heard the unmistakable sound of the patio gate unlatching, followed by it swinging open. I waited, expecting a knock at the door, but nothing. Instead, I saw legs, just legs, walking past the window. My heart stopped. When I worked up the courage to check, the gate was securely latched. There was no one there. I couldn't explain it. Things got even stranger, like pictures inexplicably falling off the walls. One picture in the bathroom fell off while I was standing right in front of it, striking me in the back. The nail was still firmly in place. Another time, a larger picture fell in my bedroom, narrowly missing my nephew, who was asleep in my bed at the time. Everything shifted when I met my first boyfriend. He was involved in the occult, dabbling in black magic and surrounded by people who practiced similar things. One of his cousins even owned a custom-made Ouija board. Out of curiosity, my friend and I decided to try it one evening. Nothing happened during the session, but in the days that followed, things began to spiral out of control. One night, I was in my room when I heard faint tapping on my window. I assumed it was a friend, but when I looked, there was no one there. The tapping continued, growing louder and more deliberate. The weirdness didn't stop there. One night, while I was flipping through an old photo album, I noticed a straw hat perched on top of a basketball near some candles on the TV stand. Without warning, the hat caught fire. I quickly yelled for my mom and smothered the flames with a nearby blanket. The hat was destroyed, but the basketball remained, with a strange, permanent ring burned into its surface. Days later, while cleaning my room, I found the Ouija board tucked under my bed. I had watched my friend take it home. That was the breaking point for me. I threw it away for good. Soon after, I started working as a housekeeper in a Masonic retirement home, a job that would prove to be just as strange as everything else I'd experienced. The building itself was old and eerie, with dimly lit hallways and creaky floors. The staff often shared stories about strange sightings and unsettling sounds. One coworker described seeing a woman in a long blue dress, without a head, walking up a ramp. She said the woman had demanded someone work with her in the basement or she would quit. But the place that truly haunted me was the embalming room in the smaller building. It was hidden behind unmarked doors, and out of curiosity, I decided to take a look one day. What I found sent a chill through my spine. An old examination table, rusted tools, and something that appeared to be bone fragments in a small oven-like device. The moment I opened the door, I felt an overwhelming, cold presence rush over me. I slammed the door shut and left, convinced that I had disturbed something best left undisturbed. I quit not long after that, and even now, when I think back on those experiences, I still feel a chill. Some places hold onto the energy of the things that happened there, and I've come to believe I encountered that energy firsthand. When I was about 9 years old, my uncle, who I had always been close to, made the decision that he couldn't keep fighting his battle with cancer any longer. 9 months later, he passed away quietly in my grandmother's house. Little did I know, that night would mark the start of something strange, something I didn't fully understand back then. My grandmother would often tell me that she could feel his presence. She said he would sit at the end of her bed each night to say goodnight. For a while, this brought her comfort. But eventually, those visits stopped, and it felt as though he had finally found peace. Years passed, and nothing out of the ordinary happened. Until I was 19, pregnant with my son. That's when the odd experiences began again. There's a pattern in my family. Whenever someone is about to give birth, another relative tends to pass away just before the baby arrives. This time, it was my great-uncle Tommy. It was March, and the family was preparing for his wake at my grandmother's house. The weather was uncertain, with rain predicted, and we debated whether to rent tables and chairs for the outdoor patio. Eventually, we decided to go ahead and rent them, though we weren't sure if the rain would hold off. That night, I was staying at my parents' house when the phone rang at 3 a.m. Groggily, I answered. On the other end, I heard my Uncle Tommy's unmistakable southern drawl. He told me it wasn't going to rain, that everything would be fine. At the same moment, my mom picked up the phone and overheard the tail end of the conversation. She was freaked out and woke up my dad, but by then, the call had ended and the line was dead. I tried convincing myself it was just a dream, but my mom had heard it too. It was him. I couldn't deny it. 2 months later, in May, after a difficult delivery, I gave birth to my son. Once I was home recovering, something happened that I still can't explain. One night, I woke up to see a little girl standing at the end of my bed. She was dressed in all white, her dress, her boots, everything. Her appearance reminded me of something from an old-fashioned story, like Little House on the Prairie. She didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there staring at me before glancing at the cradle where my son slept. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. By the time I found my voice, she was gone. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, picked up my baby, and moved to another room for the rest of the night. The next night, I woke again to see her. This time, she was standing beside the bed, peering down at my son as he slept. Terrified, I grabbed my baby and fled the room. To this day, I've never slept in that room again. A couple of years later, when my son was 2, we moved into my cousin's house. It was a big place with 4 bedrooms, one for her daughter, a playroom, and one for me and my son. Soon after we moved in, I saw the little girl again. She appeared in my room, but this time, something felt different. My cousin started noticing odd things too, like hearing the girl play in the kids' playroom late at night. Over time, we both came to believe she had taken up residence in that house. Everyone who passed by my old room claimed to have seen her. Despite her presence, she always seemed harmless, even friendly. Not long ago, I moved back into my grandmother's house to save some money. I knew I'd be staying in the room closest to where my uncle had passed away years earlier. Almost immediately, I could feel his presence. One night, while chatting with my boyfriend on the phone, I glanced at the reflection in a picture hanging above my bed. I saw my uncle's face. I quickly turned around, but no one was there. I tried brushing it off and went to sleep. The next morning, I mentioned it to my grandmother, and she told me that at around the same time, around 10 p.m., she had also seen him standing in the hallway. We didn't think much of it until later that day, when we got a call saying that my grandmother's aunt had passed away that night, at exactly 10 p.m. Some might chalk this up to coincidence, or say that my mind is just playing tricks on me. But I know what I saw. These aren't random events. They're connections to something beyond this world. I don't know why these spirits keep reaching out to me, but I believe there's a reason behind it. A few years ago, my best friend Michael was left in charge of his parents' farmhouse in the small town of Pine Lake, Wisconsin, while his father was away working on a project in Alaska. The farmhouse was an old, sprawling property, situated at the edge of a wooded area that had been part of the town's history for over a century. To help him out, I moved in and shared the responsibility of keeping the house in order. Michael's dog, Daisy, stayed with us as well, which made the large, quiet house feel a little less eerie. Shortly after settling in, I began to notice strange sounds. At first, I assumed it was just the usual creaks and groans that come with an old house settling. But then Daisy's behavior began to catch my attention. She would sit motionless in the living room, staring into the dark corner near the fireplace. Sometimes she would whine, paw at the air, or bark sharply at nothing. Thinking she might need to go outside or was hungry, I'd check on her, but she didn't seem to want anything. She was fixated on whatever was in that corner, completely still, like she was waiting for something. Things grew even stranger when I was alone at night. I would hear footsteps on the stairs or what sounded like the old wooden back door creaking open and closed. At times, I even heard someone walking around on the porch outside. I told Michael about it, and he admitted that he'd noticed Daisy acting strangely too. He also mentioned that his older sister, Emily, had experienced odd occurrences in the house before. Emily had recently returned home after finishing her college semester, and I couldn't wait to talk to her about everything. She had always been interested in the paranormal, practicing some forms of energy work and reading tarot cards. I knew if anyone could shed some light on what was happening, it would be her. When we finally had the chance to sit down, she told me that she had encountered the spirits in the house several times before. She even knew their names, Samuel and Alice. They were a couple who had lived there over 100 years ago. Emily explained that Samuel was a playful spirit who liked to make his presence known by walking around the house or playing pranks on people. He was probably the one responsible for Daisy's strange behavior. Alice, however, was much quieter and more concerned about the house being kept neat and in order. If things got too messy or noisy, she would show her displeasure in subtle ways, moving things around or even knocking objects off shelves. Once Emily moved back in, it seemed like Samuel and Alice noticed her presence. Whenever we laughed too loudly or played music a little too high, the pictures on the walls would fall. Keys would disappear and then show up in strange places, like in the bathroom cabinet or hidden inside a kitchen drawer. We started joking that Samuel was up to his old tricks, saying, "Looks like Samuel's having a little fun again." At first, I wasn't scared. The spirits seemed more mischievous than malicious. That all changed the night I actually saw one of them. My boyfriend, Ben, came over to watch a movie with us. The night stretched on, and it got so late that he decided to stay. We headed to my room, locked the door behind us. I always locked it because Daisy had a bad habit of pushing it open to try and sleep on the bed, and I didn't like waking up covered in dog fur. I was almost asleep when I heard a sound near the door. I glanced over and froze. There, standing in the doorway, was the outline of a tall figure wearing an old-fashioned white shirt and black pants. He He was still, silent, just watching us. I grabbed Ben's arm and whispered, "Ben, I thought I locked the door. Did you open it? Do you see him?" By the time he turned to look, the figure was gone. He immediately turned on the lamp, and I scrambled under the covers, my heart pounding. When I got up to check the door, it was still locked. Looking back, I think Samuel didn't appreciate Ben being there. He probably wanted to scare me, and he certainly succeeded. Hearing footsteps and strange noises was one thing, but seeing a ghost was a whole different level. After that night, I realized I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I moved out and found a new apartment, free from spirits. It's been almost 3 years since I left, but I still sleep with a nightlight, and I keep the covers pulled up over my head. Some experiences never truly leave you, no matter how much time has passed. Growing up, my family lived on a quiet road in a small town, just on the edge of Pine Lake. The road stretched along the edge of a vast field, bordered by thick forests of towering pine trees. Beyond the trees was the town's old cemetery, a forgotten place that had been there for generations. The field was our playground, a spot where my friends and I spent countless afternoons, running through the tall grass or, in the winter, building snow forts in the deep drifts. On the coldest days, we would sneak into the cemetery, finding small hills of snow perfect for sliding down. It was the winter of my 11th year when the strange events began. A fierce snowstorm hit, dumping inches of snow across the entire town, followed by sleet that froze everything into a solid sheet of ice. The temperature dropped so low that the town's schools closed for several days. My mom warned us to stay inside, but after being stuck indoors for 2 days, my friend Michelle and I couldn't resist the urge to explore the fresh snow. We bundled up in layers of thick clothing and headed out into the frozen world. The snow was deep, up to our knees, and with every step, the ice beneath us creaked and groaned. The wind cut through our clothes, making it feel colder than it really was, but we pushed on, eager to see how high the snow had piled up in the graveyard. We figured the drifts would be well over 8 feet tall. When we finally reached the edge of the cemetery, we paused. The sight before us was stunning. The snow was untouched, an endless expanse of smooth white, glimmering in the weak sunlight, and the only sound was the howling wind. Then, out of nowhere, Michelle grabbed my arm, her hand trembling. I struggled to keep my balance in the snow as I turned to look in the direction she was pointing. My heart stopped. There, no more than 10 yards away, stood a figure. It was a man tall, unnaturally tall, and dressed in a black suit. He didn't move, just stood there in the middle of the snow, completely still. Despite the freezing cold, he wore no coat, and his skin was almost unnaturally pale, glowing against the white backdrop of the cemetery. His eyes locked onto ours, glowing with an unnatural light that pierced right through me. What was even more unsettling was how he stood. He wasn't sinking into the snow like we were. He seemed to float just above it, as if gravity had no hold on him, and there were no footprints around him. None. He was just there. Panic surged through me. I grabbed Michelle's arm, and we turned to run, but the snow was too thick. Every step was a struggle. Our hearts pounded as we scrambled toward the street, the wind roaring in our ears. We didn't dare look back until we were safely across the road, standing in the driveway of my house. We were out of breath, our bodies shaking with the cold, but we didn't speak about it. Michelle left soon after, and the memory of what we'd seen was locked away, unspoken, between us. From that day on, we never returned to that field or the cemetery. The following year, my family moved to a small farmhouse out in the country, far from that strange place, but the memory stayed with me. I started having vivid dreams, replays of that day. In the dream, the man in black would appear just as he had in the cemetery, his eyes glowing, his pale face frozen in that eternal stare. His feet hovered above the snow, leaving no trace behind. I would wake up, drenched in sweat, the image of him still seared into my mind. For years I convinced myself that it was just my imagination. Maybe the sun's reflection on the snow had created an illusion, or perhaps the freezing cold had made me see things. But deep down, I wasn't sure. Then about 4 years later, Michelle and I were with a group of friends, sharing ghost stories. When it was Michelle's turn, she looked at me, her eyes wide, and began recounting that day in the cemetery. She didn't miss a single detail. Hearing her words sent a shiver down my spine, but at the same time, I felt a strange relief. I hadn't imagined it. She had seen him too. Afterward, Michelle and I spoke privately. That's when I learned she had been having the same dream, reliving the exact same moments, every night, just like me. We had never told anyone, our parents, our friends, because we feared they would laugh at us. But even now, over 20 years later, I still sometimes have that dream. The figure in the snow, his glowing eyes, his stillness, remains just as vivid as that first day I saw him. Last summer, my husband and I took our good friend, Sarah, not her real name, on a trip to the Rocky Mountains. She had been planning to move to Colorado to start fresh with her long-term, on-again/off-again boyfriend, and she wanted to check out the area before committing. It was the first time we met him, and honestly, we liked him right away. By the fall, Sarah had officially moved to Colorado after leaving the military. We kept in touch, calling and emailing frequently, and she seemed to be adjusting well to life in her new home. The next summer, Sarah called with exciting news. They were engaged. She was over the moon, but admitted that their relationship wasn't without its struggles. At one point, she even called off the wedding, but by August, she told me it was back on and set for October. Sarah knew my husband, and I wouldn't be able to attend due to our work schedules, but she kept me in the loop, calling often to share all the details about her wedding plans. In October, Sarah traveled to Chicago, where she and her fiancé had first met, to wrap up the final wedding preparations. The ceremony took place on October 13th, and it sounded like it was beautiful. We spoke one last time before her big day, and my husband and I wished them nothing but the best. But then, just a few days later, on that Tuesday when I returned home from work, there was a message from Sarah on my answering machine. She sounded upset, and I assumed something must have gone wrong with the wedding or perhaps with her new in-laws. I called her back, ready to listen and offer some support, but when she picked up, her voice was strange, flat, almost robotic. She told me that they had returned to Colorado the night before, and her fiancé, Ben, not his real name, had gone to work the following morning. Then she told me that something terrible had happened. Ben had fallen off a ladder onto their concrete driveway. He didn't make it. I couldn't believe it. It didn't feel real. Just days before, Sarah had married the love of her life, and now he was gone. I was in complete shock. I couldn't attend the funeral, but I was already scheduled to travel to Colorado the following weekend for a work trip. I decided to stop by and check on Sarah before heading back home. My work unit was based on the western side of the state, a good 5-hour drive from her, but I knew I had to be there for her. As I drove through New Mexico, about 2 hours from the Colorado border, I suddenly began to smell cologne. It wasn't my husband's scent, but I figured maybe some of his fragrance had lingered in the car. The scent wasn't constant, though. It would drift across my face every so often, and I didn't think much of it at the time. When I started the steep, winding drive up the mountains, I decided to put on a calming playlist to ease my nerves. As I drove higher, one particular song came on. There was a line in the lyrics that said, "Climb to the top of the ladder." As soon as that line played, the music abruptly stopped. Confused, I pressed play again. The song played until it hit the same line, and then stopped again. Without even thinking, I muttered aloud, "Ben, I get it. Now stop messing with me." After that, the song played without any further issues. You see, Ben had died from falling off a ladder, and it felt like he was trying to let me know he was still there. I wasn't planning on telling Sarah about the experience. I figured it might upset her, but when I arrived at her place and we sat together on her porch, she began telling me about all the signs she had been receiving from Ben. Feeling encouraged, I shared my own story. As I described the cologne I had smelled in the car, Sarah stood up, went inside, and returned with a bottle of cologne. "Did it smell like this?" she asked, handing it to me. I took a deep breath, and it was the exact same scent. She smiled, her eyes filled with comfort, knowing that Ben was still with her, still watching over her. I've had experiences like this for as long as I can remember, and I always tell people, our loved ones are never truly gone. If they can find a way to let us know they're still with us, they will. I've always been fascinated by ghosts, drawn to other people's eerie experiences, but until recently, I'd never had one of my own. That all changed about 4 months ago. I was staying at my boyfriend Michael's house that night. It had been a quiet evening. We spent time with friends, had a few drinks, chatted for a while, and then headed to bed. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly, a strange sense of unease washing over me. There in the dim light, I saw a figure moving across the room. I assumed it was Michael, getting up to grab a drink, so I rolled over to his side of the bed. To my surprise, he was still fast asleep. A cold chill ran through me as I realized the figure was still there. It had stopped moving and was now sitting at the top of the bed, right next to Michael's head. My heart pounded as I told myself it had to be my imagination. But then something caught my eye. The streetlight outside cast a faint glow through a gap in the curtains, and the figure's shadow was blocking that light, confirming it wasn't just a dream. Terrified, I turned over and tried to go back to sleep, forcing my mind to calm itself. The next morning, I told Michael what had happened. He shrugged it off, calling it nonsense, and I tried to convince myself it was just a figment of my imagination, hoping it would fade away. A month later, Michael and I were staying at a friend's house after a night out. There wasn't enough room on the couch, so Michael decided to sleep in the armchair across the room from me. A few hours later, I woke up and glanced over. That same figure was sitting near him, just like before. This time, I could see it more clearly. It looked like a man with a bald head. My heart raced, and I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would disappear. But when I opened them again, it was still there. Trying to stay calm, I called Michael over to the couch to sleep beside me. He grumbled, saying I was being ridiculous, but came over anyway. Relieved, I turned back to the armchair, and the figure was gone. Just as I was about to close my eyes, something made me look back, and there it was again staring at me. Michael was fast asleep, oblivious. I didn't know what to do, so I squeezed my eyes shut and waited until I finally drifted off to sleep. This time, I couldn't write it off as imagination. I told Michael and our friend about what I'd seen, but they both dismissed it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. I asked Michael if anyone in his family who had passed away had been bald. He thought for a moment and then said, "Yeah, my grandpa. He passed before I was born." I don't know how to explain what I saw, but I wonder if it was Michael's grandpa, maybe acting as some kind of guardian spirit. I haven't found the courage to look at a picture of him yet, but maybe one day I will. There's another story I want to share about my dad. He's always been skeptical about ghosts, never really believing in anything supernatural. But one experience from his youth has stuck with him, something he can't explain. When my dad was younger, he and my grandpa were walking through a cemetery in Pine Lake, where many of our family members are buried. It was around 9 a.m. on a quiet Sunday morning. As they walked along the path, something strange happened. They suddenly realized the graveyard was gone. In place of headstones and familiar pathways, there were only empty fields stretching endlessly around them. The air was still heavy. Then, just as quickly as it had disappeared, the graveyard returned. Birds flew overhead, the sounds of the world came back, and everything was normal again. Both my dad and grandpa saw it, and to this day, my dad believes they somehow slipped into another time for a brief moment. It's the only paranormal experience he's ever believed in. I've always wondered if anyone else has experienced something similar, or if there's a way to explain it. When I was younger, my family moved around a lot. I'm not sure if it was because of a desire for something better or simply a need for change, but one of our last moves took us to a small town called Pine Lake, Colorado. We settled in a modest cabin-style house tucked away in the woods, surrounded by vast, untamed forests and endless fields. As someone who grew up in the hustle and bustle of a big city, I despised the isolation. The quiet was suffocating, and the eerie sounds of the forest at night only added to my discomfort. The only solace I found was in the thunderstorms that rolled in from the mountains. They were magnificent, the lightning illuminating the entire sky, and the thunder shaking the very ground beneath us. Our living room had the perfect window for storm watching, and I often found myself sitting there, unable to tear my eyes away from the raw power of nature. But one stormy night, something happened that I would never forget. I had trouble sleeping that night. No reason, just restlessness. I kept waking up, tossing and turning, unable to find comfort. After what felt like hours, I gave up trying to sleep and decided to watch the storm from the living room, hoping it would calm my restless mind. I grabbed my blanket, tipped it into the next room, and curled up on the floor by the window, letting the storm's fury soothe me. A few minutes passed when I heard a faint rustling sound from the kitchen. I turned my head, but the house was still. I figured it was just the house settling, an old wood cabin creaking under the weight of the storm. But then it came again, a soft scraping sound, like wood against wood. This time I turned around, and that's when I noticed something strange. The top drawer in the kitchen was open halfway. I assumed it was just my little brother messing around, so I got up, closed the drawer, and glanced around the kitchen. But there was no one. The house was empty, just the storm and me. I returned to my spot by the window, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. Then it happened again. That same scraping sound. Only this time, I wasn't imagining it. I turned around mid-sentence, about to scold my brother for playing tricks on me, but what I saw froze me in place. Standing in front of the open drawer was a pale, foggy figure of a woman. She looked almost translucent, her outline barely visible against the darkness of the kitchen. She was staring into the drawer, moving in slow, deliberate motions. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. And then she turned and looked at me. Her eyes were hollow, her face gaunt and wrinkled, her features sharp as though carved from stone. In her hand, she held something shiny, glinting in the dim light, though I couldn't make out what it was. Fear gripped me, and my body finally reacted. I bolted up and ran toward the hallway that led to my parents' room. But as I turned the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. She was there, right in front of me. I slipped on the hardwood floor, crashing into the wall, my heart racing in my chest. From where I lay, she loomed over me, her foggy form leaning down, her breath cold against my skin. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could only bang my fist against the wall, hoping, praying that someone would wake up. And then, everything changed. At the sound of my banging, the woman seemed to panic. She let out a soundless cry, her form swirling into a cloud of white fog, vanishing as quickly as she had appeared. Relieved but still trembling, I tried to get up, to run to my parents, but the pain stopped me. A sharp, searing pain shot through my side. I thought it was from the fall, but then I felt something cold and hard pressing into my skin. My hand reached down to my side, and that's when I saw it, the hilt of a steak knife sticking out of me, the same knife she had taken from the drawer. The pain was unbearable, but I kept banging on the wall, desperate for help. The next thing I knew, I woke up in a hospital bed, the memory of that night haunting me. To this day, I don't know what happened. I've tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just a bad dream, or maybe an intruder, but the house was locked. The windows were secure, and there was no sign of a break-in, and the scar on my side. That's a reminder I can't escape. Whatever happened that night, it was real. Even now, years later, I can't bring myself to fully accept or understand what I experienced. Hey everyone! I put a lot of effort and heart into creating these videos just for you. If you're enjoying the content, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a quick comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Your support means the world to me, and it keeps me motivated to bring more awesome videos your way. I never thought of myself as a big fan of ghost stories. Sure, I had an interest in the unknown, but I never took it too seriously. That all changed one autumn night in 1993, an experience that still lingers in my memory, something I can't fully explain. At the time, I had just enlisted in the U.S. Navy, and it was about my 4th week of boot camp at the Great Lakes Naval Training Center near Chicago. One evening, I was assigned the dreaded 2:00 a.m. fire watch shift. My duty was to patrol the barracks, where about 80 of my fellow recruits were fast asleep, keeping an eye out for any potential dangers, whether it was fire, equipment failure, or something else out of place. The next 2 hours would be long, and I knew the shift would drag on. About an hour into my shift, I heard something unusual. From the back of the barracks came the distinct sound of dog tags hitting the wooden floor, the unmistakable clink you'd hear when someone was doing push-ups. I even caught the faint sound of labored breathing, as if someone were working hard to pass a physical test. I was curious but chalked it up to one of my shipmates sneaking in a late-night workout, trying to get in shape for a physical readiness test. I walked toward the noise, thinking I'd catch someone in the act. The closer I got, the louder the sound grew, but just as I was about 15 feet away, it suddenly stopped. I scoured the area, but all I found were my fellow recruits snoring away in their racks. It felt strange, but I dismissed it, returned to my post, and wrote down the incident in the logbook. Just 5 minutes later, the noise began again. This time, I rushed toward the back of the barracks, determined to catch the culprit. But just as before, when I reached the halfway point, the sound stopped again. I searched thoroughly, but once again, there was nothing. No one was there. By this point, my unease was creeping in. I called down to the quarterdeck and reported the incident to the officer on duty, OOD, explaining that I might have heard an unauthorized person in the barracks. He said he'd come to check it out. When the OOD showed up, I told him what I'd heard. He seemed skeptical, but agreed to stick around. We waited quietly, both of us listening intently. 10 minutes later, just as the OOD was about to leave, the sound began again. Both of us froze, listening. The sound was unmistakable, dog tags clinking against the floor, followed by the sound of heavy breathing. We crept toward the noise, taking slow, deliberate steps. But once again, the sound stopped as soon as we were within 20 feet of it. At this point, neither of us knew what to think. We decided to call the Shore Patrol, SP, to investigate. When they arrived, the senior officer seemed uninterested in our story. He told us that other recruits had experienced the same thing over the years in that barracks. In fact, it was an old story, one that had been passed around for a while. He shrugged it off and left us to finish our shift alone. I didn't hear the sound again that night. I finished my shift, but I won't lie, I was on edge. When my shift ended, I went to bed, but the eerie feeling didn't leave me. The next day, I mentioned the incident to my company commander. To my surprise, he didn't dismiss it. He actually seemed familiar with the story. He told me that, according to local legend, back in the 1950s, a young recruit had tragically taken his own life in that very barracks. Some say his spirit still haunts the place, unable to rest. I can't say for sure if that story is true, but I know what I heard that night. With everyone else asleep, I clearly heard the sound of dog tags hitting the floor and the unmistakable sound of labored breathing. And I wasn't the only one. The OOD heard it too. Whatever it was, I'll never forget that night. As an aspiring actor, I've been lucky enough to perform with a number of community theater groups in my town. One thing I've noticed about almost every theater, no matter how old or modern, is that they all seem to have their own resident ghost. It's become a bit of a tradition to hear stories about these spirits during rehearsals or when chatting backstage. One particular theater stands out to me. It's an old, converted church at the edge of the historic district, surrounded by towering oak trees and grand, aging mansions. The stage is built right where the choir and the pastor used to sit, but the original pews are still there, now serving as seating for the audience. This theater is unique in that it specializes in original works, and it proudly claims to be home to 4 resident ghosts. I remember one time being shown a photo, supposedly taken of one of these ghosts. The image appeared to be just a trick of light reflecting off the stained glass windows, but the owner of the theater was so excited about it. I didn't have the heart to say anything that might spoil their enthusiasm. One Friday evening, the owner called me out of the blue. An actor in one of the running productions had broken his leg, and they needed me to step into his role. It wasn't a major part, just a character seated at a diner table in the background, sipping coffee and reading a prop newspaper. It was a light-hearted, humorous play, and I was happy to join in, even though it was a last-minute substitution. One night, near the end of the run, something strange happened. I was sitting on stage, going through my usual routine, when I noticed something unusual in the audience. The first pew, just a few feet from the stage, was usually empty, especially on nights with smaller crowds. But that night, there was a woman sitting on the far left of the pew. Her presence startled me. Most of the audience had clustered toward the center of the room for a better view, so seeing her all alone in that spot was strange. From my position, I could make out that her hair was styled in a bun, and she wore a high-necked, old-fashioned dress, something that could have come straight out of the Victorian era. It was too dark to see her face clearly, but her posture was striking, upright and poised, with an almost regal air. When my lines came up, I focused back on the play. After my short scene, I returned to my chair and glanced back at the woman. She was smiling softly, her expression serene, almost proud. But when the lights came up for the curtain call, she was gone. For the next 4 performances, she reappeared each time, always in the same spot, always smiling at the production. She never stayed for the curtain call, vanishing before the lights came up. Her consistent presence piqued my curiosity, so after the 5th night, I mentioned her to the theater manager, who usually stayed in the lobby to greet patrons. The manager's reaction was unexpected. She gave me a look that I couldn't quite read and then asked if the woman had been wearing Victorian-style clothing with her hair in a bun. When I confirmed, she clapped her hands together in excitement and told me that I had just seen the theater's most famous ghost. According to the stories, this woman had a great love for the theater and appeared to watch performances she enjoyed. In the following performances, the attendance increased, and the front pew was often filled with people. Oddly, the woman didn't appear on those nights, but whenever the crowd thinned out and the pew was empty again, she would return. Strangely enough, no one else in the cast ever saw her, even though I described exactly where she was sitting. On the final night of the show, the theater hosted a champagne reception in the basement, which had been converted into a cozy little restaurant. While everyone was mingling and celebrating, I caught a glimpse of the staircase leading from the lobby to the basement. Standing at the top of the stairs, I saw the woman again. This time, she wasn't smiling. Her expression was somber, almost sad. Before I could take in what I was seeing, someone walked in front of me, and she vanished without a trace. No one knows for sure who she is, but there are rumors that she was an actress who once lived in the area long ago. Her presence never felt threatening, just curious, almost as if she were there to watch over the performances. Sadly, I've performed in 3 more productions at that theater since then, but I've never seen her again. Maybe those shows weren't to her liking. Growing up, my mom, Emily, often shared stories from her childhood, stories that weren't just about farm life, but about the things that couldn't be explained. As a kid, I listened in awe, but looking back, I can't help but wonder if those stories still haunt her. I want to share some of those eerie experiences with you. Emily grew up in an old farmhouse out in the quiet, rolling hills of Kentucky. It was the kind of place you could only find if you took a long drive down back roads, away from the nearest town. She lived there with her older brother, older sister, and younger sister. The house wasn't big by any means, so the kids had to share rooms. Emily's 2 sisters slept in the big room downstairs. Her brother had the room across the hall, and Emily herself made her bed up in the attic, right under the creaky rafters. The first strange event happened when Emily was about 10 years old. She was homesick, along with her brother, who had gone down to the kitchen to grab a snack. As Emily rested on the old mattress in the attic, She heard a voice, clear as day, calling her name from the bottom of the stairs. It was a woman's voice, but that didn't make sense. Her brother was the only other person at the house. She stayed completely still, hoping to brush it off, but then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps slowly climbing the stairs. The steps sounded like heels clicking on wood, echoing in the empty house. Hours later, her brother returned, and when she asked him who had been on the stairs, he looked at her, bewildered, and told her no one had been there. Not long after, something even stranger happened. Emily's mom, Sarah, was in the kitchen, preparing supper. She turned to check on the table and found that 2 of the chairs had been pulled out. She pushed them back in, thinking nothing of it. But when she turned around again, 3 chairs had moved. The chairs kept being pulled further away from the table, one by one. After a while, all 6 chairs were pulled out. At the time, Emily's youngest sister, Lily, was only a baby, too small to move the chairs. Sarah was left standing in the middle of the kitchen, shaken, but unsure of what to do. Over the years, the family got used to strange things happening around the house. Items would disappear, keys, silverware, a family Bible, and then show up again days later, always in the same spot. The weirdest part, the items always came back in a specific order. First Sarah's things, then Emily's brothers, then her older sisters, and lastly, Emily's. Each time it happened, it felt like something or someone was watching them, waiting for them to notice. But it was the event that happened one night that pushed them all to leave the house for good. Emily's older sister, Jess, was babysitting Lily when they heard a knock at the door. Jess opened it to find no one there. Figuring it was just the wind, she went into the kitchen to grab a glass of water. When she returned to the living room, Lily was gone. Jess went into full panic mode, searching the whole house. It wasn't until she climbed up to the attic that she found Lily, fast asleep in her bed. The weird part? Lily was too numb to have climbed the steep stairs on her own. Jess brought her downstairs, trying to shake the unease off, but as she was trying to calm herself down, the phone rang. It was their mom, calling with terrible news. Jess's father had passed away, and she wouldn't be back that night. As Jess hung up the phone, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming toward her. She turned, but no one was there. Then, a voice, weak, frail, called out from the shadows. Jess. Frozen in terror, Jess was just about to bolt out of the house when Lily's small voice broke the silence. Jess, she said, her eyes wide. Aunt Krista's here. The name sent a shiver down Jess's spine. Krista? She asked. The next morning, Jess asked Sarah about the name. Sarah hesitated, her face going pale. Krista was my sister, she said quietly. She died here 30 years ago. That was the final straw. After that night, the family packed up and moved away, leaving behind the house and whatever lingering spirits still called it home. None of us ever returned to that old farmhouse, and I doubt any of us ever will. It was the fall of 1973 when our family moved into a house on the edge of a small town called Pine Lake, a quiet place known for its dense woods and old, creaky homes. At the time, it seemed like just another move, but this house proved to be anything but ordinary. We had no idea that it came with a history of strange happenings until we started experiencing them for ourselves. In the beginning, the oddities were small, lights flickering on and off when no one was near the switch. Our mother, always calm and practical, would brush it off, blaming one of us 7 kids for playing pranks. Most of us just shrugged it off as nothing, but as the days passed, the events grew more unsettling and harder to ignore. One evening, when I was 15, I had an experience I couldn't explain. I was the oldest of the kids, taking a bath upstairs in one of the 2 bathrooms. As I soaked in the tub, I heard what sounded like our new kitten playing in the hallway just outside. It sounded like it was tearing up the newspaper we laid out near its litter box. I remember thinking, great, now I'll have to redo that paper, and deciding I'd make one of my younger brothers clean it up later. When I finished my bath and walked downstairs, I was surprised to find that the newspaper was still exactly where it had been, neatly in place, not torn up at all. I found my siblings gathered in the living room, watching TV, and the kitten was curled up, sleeping peacefully in my sister's lap. I asked who had been upstairs, but they all shrugged and said, "Not me." When I asked my sister how long the kitten had been on her lap, she replied, "Over an hour." I knew what I had heard, but there was no explanation for it. Another strange occurrence took place in the attic. Our attic was huge, running the length of the entire house. It had plenty of space to move around, and we used it as a playroom. For Christmas that year, we had been given a small, cheap pool table, and we spent hours up there. Sometimes at night, we would hear the sound of the pool balls rolling across the wooden floor. My siblings and I would lie in my brother's room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds. We'd remain completely still until the noise stopped. The next morning, my brother and I would go up to check, and the pool balls were always in the exact same place as the last time we left them. But the pool balls weren't the only things making noise up there. Other nights, we hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps, hard-soled shoes pacing back and forth across the floor, the rhythmic, deliberate steps of a man. But it wasn't our father. He didn't live with us in this house, so who, or what, was walking around up there? Most of the strange events occurred at night, but the scariest experience happened during the day. One afternoon, my sister and I were watching TV in the living room. It was one of those old-fashioned sets where you had to turn a dial to change the channels. No remote controls in those days. Out of nowhere, the TV began changing channels on its own. First, it flipped to one channel, then another. Then it spun through all the channels in one smooth motion before finally stopping. A moment later, the channel spun backward, stopping right back where we had been watching. Neither of us stayed to see if it would happen again. We ran out of that house faster than I've ever run before. I think most of the family was already outside by then. Even now, over 25 years later, we still talk about that house during family gatherings. For a long time, our mother denied that anything unusual happened. But a few years ago, she finally admitted that she had experienced things too. She just didn't want to scare us at the time. Some people don't believe our stories. They think we're exaggerating or letting our imaginations get the best of us. But my family and I know what we experienced. We're firm believers in the unexplained. When I was about 15 years old, I'm 31 now, my best friend, Michael, lived in a house on the outskirts of Pine Lake, a small town surrounded by thick woods and foggy roads. The house, without a doubt, was haunted. The previous owners wouldn't even talk about it. That alone says enough, doesn't it? Strange things happened all the time. Lights flickered on and off, dishes would float and crash, shadowy figures appeared in mirrors, heavy footsteps echoed through empty rooms, and doors slammed shut on their own. It felt like every cliched haunting you could imagine was happening there. One time, Michael and I came home from school and thought his mom was home, doing laundry. The dryer was running, so we assumed she just started it. But when we checked, no one had been home all day. That house had a way of making you question everything. But the scariest thing that ever happened to me there, the one that still makes my heart race when I think about it, was something I'll never forget. It happened one night when Michael and I were working out in his basement. The radio was playing in the background, just loud enough to hear over our grunting and movement. Suddenly, the volume dropped to almost nothing. Thinking it was just a glitch, we went to the other room and turned it back up. But a few minutes later, it happened again. The volume turned itself all the way down. This time, we stopped, really looked at the radio. It wasn't a button you could accidentally bump. It was an old radio, the kind with a knob you had to physically turn to adjust the volume. That gave us both an uneasy feeling, but we shrugged it off and went back to our workout. That's when things took a terrifying turn. Out of nowhere, we heard footsteps pounding up the stairs, a door slamming shut, and then more footsteps running up to another floor, followed by a second door slamming. The noise was so loud, it echoed through the house. We froze for a moment before mustering the courage to go upstairs and check it out. But when we did, there was nothing. No one was home except for us. After the workout, I decided to head home. My usual route was through Michael's backyard, past a few bushes, and onto the street. As I got about 300 feet away, I glanced back at the house. The backyard light was flickering on and off, like someone was flipping a switch. Then the light stayed on, and that's when I saw it. A dark, shadowy figure standing there, completely still. My stomach dropped. Before I could process what I was seeing, the figure started walking toward me. I picked up my pace, trying to stay calm, but when I started walking faster, the figure began running. And it wasn't just running, it was sprinting. I panicked and broke into a full run, slipping on the icy ground but scrambling back up. It was right behind me, so close I could feel the pressure of being chased. I cut through a neighbor's yard, leaped over a small stream, barely making it. When I looked back, the figure had stopped at the edge of the stream, not following me across. I ran the rest of the way home without stopping. When I got inside, I was still shaking. No one was home, so I grabbed the phone and called Michael. I was convinced it had to be him playing a prank. But when he answered, he had no idea what I was talking about. I told him everything, and he was just as freaked out as I was. The next night I was working out again, but this time at another friend's house down the street. While we were in the basement, we heard a loud slam on the cellar door. We ran to look, and there it was, that same dark figure. It was standing outside, staring at us through the basement window. I had to explain the whole story to my other friend, who didn't believe me at first. But when I left his house that night, I looked back again, and my heart sank. The figure was there, standing just beyond the house. Then, as if to taunt me, it started running toward me again. I didn't wait. I ran as fast as I could, taking a completely different route this time. But no matter which way I went, it followed. I don't know how, but it always stayed right behind me, close enough that I could hear it, but never quite catching me. When I finally got home, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my chest heaving. That was the last time I ever looked back. The next day, I retraced my steps in the daylight. There were footprints in the snow, following mine all the way to the stream. But then, they stopped, just vanished, before the stream and led off into the swamp, heading back toward Michael's house. To this day, I don't know what it was, but I'm certain it didn't want me there. Michael's family swears the house is haunted, and after what I experienced, I believe them. I've had other strange encounters there, but nothing as terrifying as that. What do you think it was? Have you ever experienced something like this? I was born and raised in small-town Texas, but now I live just south of Tulsa, Oklahoma, about 2 hours away. The stories I'm about to share all took place back in my hometown, and they've stuck with me not because they were the scariest moments of my life, but because they left me with so many questions that I'd never been able to answer. When I was around 8 or 9, I had my first experience with something I can't fully explain. It was Christmas Eve. I remember sitting on my bed, wide awake, staring out the window at the still night. The house was quiet. Everyone else was already asleep. Then I heard a loud thump on the roof, followed by the sound of jingling bells. Naturally, I thought it was Santa Claus. I waited for what seemed like hours, listening, but nothing more happened. The next morning, I asked my family about it, but no one else had heard a thing. To this day, I still wonder what that noise was. Things got even stranger as I got older, especially after we moved into a new apartment during my freshman year of high school. It was an upstairs unit in a small complex, and from the moment we moved in, something just felt off. The layout was simple. A small hallway leading into the living room and kitchen, with bedrooms and a bathroom down a separate hallway. My brother, my mom, and I each had our own rooms. One night, while I was sitting on the couch watching TV, I heard my mom's bedroom door creak open, followed by the door to my room. I thought maybe she was checking on me, so I waited for her to come into the living room, but she never did. A cold chill ran through me as I realized I was the only one awake. I tried to shake it off and went to bed, telling myself it was nothing, but I couldn't quite get comfortable. A few months later, I was home alone. The TV was playing a movie on the VCR, and I was in the kitchen. Suddenly, the movie stopped, and the light in the living room flickered and went out. The light switch was by the front door, nowhere near where I was. I froze, then bolted out the back door and ran to my friend's apartment on the same landing. When I told her what had happened, she looked at me in surprise and said the exact same thing had just happened at her place. Whatever was going on didn't seem to be confined to just our apartment. Eventually, we moved to a downstairs unit in the same complex. At first, everything seemed fine, and I was relieved. But after about a year, the strange events started again. My bedroom in this new apartment had a big walk-in closet that gave me the creeps for no reason. I avoided it whenever I could. One night, while I was sitting on the couch, I heard a strange noise above me. A large picture of a ship that hung on the wall began to creak. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the sound grew louder. It was the kind of groaning noise you'd hear from a ship rocking on the waves. I sat up and listened carefully. It was real. After that, I couldn't stand being near that picture. Another time, a handbell that hung near the front door suddenly rang on its own. It was so loud it made both me and my cat jump. I checked the bell. Still and silent. That wasn't the end of it, though. One night, I heard the unmistakable sound of our patio gate unlatching. Thinking it was a friend coming over, I waited for a knock at the door. Instead, I saw a pair of legs walk past the window. When I went to check, there was no one there, and the gate was securely latched, not a sound to be heard. Things got even weirder when I found a handmade Ouija board under my bed. I hadn't put it there, and I knew my friend, who had borrowed it, had taken it back home. When I asked her about it, she was just as confused as I was. We decided to get rid of it for good, and I haven't seen it since. Years later, I worked as a housekeeper at a retirement home back in Texas. Part of my job included cleaning the infirmary, which had a bit of a reputation for being eerie. The basement, where bodies were kept before being moved to the morgue, was freezing cold even during the hottest Texas summers. One coworker claimed she'd seen a headless woman in a blue dress walking through the halls. Another time, I saw a woman walk into our break room, but when I followed, the room was empty. The strangest experience, though, came when I discovered the old embalming room. The moment I opened the door, a cold rush seemed to pass straight through me. Inside, there were rusted tools and what looked like bone fragments in the dust. I slammed the door shut and left as quickly as I could. These experiences have left me with more questions than answers. I don't know what I encountered in that apartment or at the infirmary, but I've learned to trust my instincts. Some doors, both literal and figurative, are best left closed. What do you think? Could these things have logical explanations, or was I dealing with something far beyond the ordinary? I used to be the kind of person who didn't believe in ghosts, until something happened that I couldn't explain. These experiences have stayed with me, leaving me no doubt that there's more to this world than what we can see. It all started when I was around 9 years old. My uncle, someone I was incredibly close to, had been battling cancer for years. Eventually, he reached a point where he couldn't fight anymore, and about 9 months later, he passed away in my grandmother's house, a small cottage on the outskirts of a quiet town. From that night forward, things changed in ways I didn't understand at the time. My grandmother often told me she could feel his presence. Sometimes she even see him sitting at the foot of her bed, saying good night before she fell asleep. But as the months went by, those visits stopped. It was as if he had finally found peace. Years passed with nothing unusual happening, until I turned 19 and was expecting my first child. I was 7 months pregnant, and though it was a joyful time, there was a strange pattern in our family. Whenever someone was about to have a baby, someone else in the family would pass away. This time, it was my great-uncle Tommy. Not long before my due date, the family was planning his wake at my grandmother's house. It had been raining nonstop, and we were unsure whether to rent tables and chairs for the patio or keep everything inside. After much back and forth, we decided to go ahead with the rentals. Then we all went our separate ways for the night. But that's when something happened that still confounds me. Around 3 a.m., the phone rang. I picked it up, and to my shock, I heard my Uncle Tommy's unmistakable Southern accent on the other end. He told me not to worry, that it wasn't going to rain, and everything would be fine. At the same time, my mom picked up the other line and heard the end of the conversation. She was so shaken by it that she woke my dad, but by the time they got to the phone, the line had gone dead. I tried to tell myself it was just a dream, but I knew better. My mom had heard it too, and if you'd ever heard my Uncle Tommy speak, you'd know that voice was impossible to confuse with anyone else. A couple of months later in May, I gave birth to my son after a tough labor. A few days after bringing him home, I woke up in the middle of the night to find a little girl standing at the foot of my bed. She was wearing an old-fashioned white dress and boots, like something straight out of a storybook. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, glancing from me to the cradle where my baby was sleeping. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. By the time I could move, she had vanished. I convinced myself it was just a dream and moved to another room with my baby for the rest of the night. But the next night she appeared again. This time she was standing right beside my bed, watching my son sleep. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my baby and ran out of the room. I never slept in that room again. A few years later, when my son was around 2, we moved into my cousin's house. It was a larger, older home with 4 bedrooms, and my son and I shared one of them. Not long after we moved in, I saw that same little girl again. But this time, it wasn't just me who saw her. Other people in the house started to notice her too. She became a familiar presence, often spotted in my old bedroom or playing in the kids' playroom late at night. Strangely, she didn't seem malicious, more like a forgotten spirit, lingering between 2 worlds. Recently, I moved back into my grandmother's house to save some money and pay off some debts. I ended up in the bedroom closest to where my uncle had passed away all those years ago. From the moment I moved in, I could feel his presence. One night, while I was on the phone with my boyfriend, I noticed a reflection in one of the pictures hanging above my bed. It was my uncle. I turned around, but there was no one there. I brushed it off until the next morning when I told my grandmother. To my surprise, she had seen him too, standing in the hallway. We didn't think much of it until later that day when we received a phone call. My grandmother's aunt had passed away the night before, at almost the exact same time we both saw my uncle. These experiences have taught me to trust what I see and feel. Some people might chalk these events up to coincidence, but I know what I've experienced. Whether these spirits visit me for comfort, guidance, or something else entirely, I believe they're real. What do you think? Could these be connections to the other side, or is there another explanation for what happened? Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. My family has had its share of strange, unexplainable encounters, but the one that stands out the most happened to my sister about 10 years ago when she was 20. It took place in our old home in Pine Valley, a small town nestled in the Midwest. She's 30 now, with a family of her own, but even after all these years, the memory still sends chills down our spines whenever it comes up in conversation. Let me paint a picture of the house. When you walked in through the front door, you entered the formal living room, a cozy space with old, creaky furniture. Beyond that, a long hallway stretched across the house. On the right side of the hall were 2 bedrooms, while the left side had a bathroom facing the second bedroom. The second bedroom had been converted into a narrow stairwell when the second floor was added, and the whole house was filled with the sounds of old wooden floors, footsteps, and even the clicking of dog claws were easy to hear. One afternoon, my sister found herself alone in the house and decided to take a long, relaxing bath. She left the bathroom door just slightly cracked open, maybe an inch or so. As she sank into the warm water, she started to hear one of our dogs sniffing at the gap in the door. Then came the unmistakable sound of claws tapping on the wooden stairs. It started low, at the bottom of the stairs, then moved up the hallway, back down again, and returned to the door to sniff. Amused, my sister called out, "Come in, you silly dog." But the sniffing and pacing didn't stop. She thought the dog was just being playful. and she didn't think much of it. For the next 15 to 20 minutes, she heard the same sounds: the sniffing, the light tap of paws on the stairs, and the sound of them moving up and down the hallway. It was so clear and constant that she was sure it was one of our dogs. Eventually, she finished her bath, wrapped herself in a towel, and headed to the back door to let the dog inside. But when she opened the door, she froze. Both of our dogs were outside, behind a locked door. She just stood there for a moment, staring at them, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. The sounds had been so real, so undeniable, that her first thought was that a stray dog must have wandered into the house. Panicked, she grabbed a kitchen knife and brought both dogs inside, locking the door behind her. That's how we found her when my parents and I got home, sitting on the couch, still clutching the knife, with the dogs huddled at her feet. After she calmed down, we realized the knife probably wouldn't have helped much anyway, but she was so shaken that we all went through the house, checking every room, every corner. There was no way another animal could have gotten inside, and even if it had, our dogs, both very protective of their home, would never have stayed so calmly outside. To this day, none of us can explain what she heard: the sniffing, the claws on the stairs, and the pacing in the hall. They were unmistakable. My sister is absolutely certain it wasn't her imagination, and honestly, we all believe her. I've often wondered, what would have happened if whatever it was had pushed the door open when she called it in? That's a question none of us are brave enough to answer. A few years ago, my best friend, Michael, was given the responsibility of looking after his parents' old farmhouse in the small town of Pine Lake. His father had been stationed out of state with the military, so Michael was left to care for the house by himself. To lend a hand and keep him company, I decided to move in with him. We weren't alone though. The family dog, an affectionate German shepherd named Rosie, was also staying with us. Her presence made the large, quiet house feel a bit less lonely. At first, everything felt normal. The house creaked and groaned as old houses tend to do, and I didn't think much of it. But it didn't take long for me to start noticing strange things happening around the house. The dog's behavior was the first oddity that caught my attention. She would sit in the living room, staring into the corner with an intense focus, as if watching something only she could see. Sometimes she'd whine softly or paw at the air, even barking in places where no one was. I checked to see if she needed anything, food, water, or a walk, but she never did. She just wanted to sit there and stare. As the days went on, the oddities began to escalate. At night, when I was alone, I would hear what sounded like footsteps on the creaky wooden stairs. A few times I was certain I heard the back door open and close, or the sound of someone walking on the porch. I mentioned it to Michael, and to my relief, he didn't dismiss it as my imagination. He told me his sister, Emily, had noticed strange things as well, and that he had seen Rosie acting strangely too. When Emily moved back home after finishing college, I was eager to talk to her about the strange occurrences. She had always been the most open-minded of the family and had a deep interest in the supernatural. As it turned out, she had some insights. She told me she had communicated with the spirits in the house before. There were two of them, a couple named James and Clara, who had lived in the house over a century ago. James, Emily explained, was a bit of a prankster. He liked to make noise, wander around the house, and play tricks on the living. Clara, on the other hand, was quieter, preferring everything to be neat and tidy. If things got too chaotic or messy, she would make sure to let you know. After Emily's return, it seemed like the spirits became more active. We would sit in her room talking, and if we laughed too loud or played music too loudly, the pictures on her walls would suddenly fall off. Sometimes we'd lose our car keys, only to find them in strange spots, like the bathroom drawer or under the couch cushions. We joked about it, saying, "Looks like James is having fun with us again." But things took a turn one night when I saw one of them. My boyfriend, Lucas, had come over for a movie night. It had gotten late, so he decided to stay over. We went to my room, shut the door, and locked it, something I always did since Rosie had a habit of nudging the door open to sleep on my bed. I didn't want to wake up to fur-covered sheets. I was nearly asleep when I heard a noise by the door. Groggy, I glanced over and froze. There, standing in the doorway, was the shadow of a tall man. He was dressed in an old-fashioned white shirt and black trousers. I blinked, trying to shake off the sleep in my eyes, but the figure didn't disappear. I grabbed Lucas's arm and whispered, "Did you open the door? Do you see that?" But by the time he sat up and looked, the figure was gone. I was terrified. I made Lucas turn on the light as I pulled the blanket over my head. When I finally gathered enough courage to check, the door was still closed and locked. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, how James might have been upset that Lucas stayed the night and how that was his way of letting me know. Hearing strange noises in an old house is one thing, but seeing something, that's a different kind of fear. That night was the tipping point for me. I realized I couldn't stay there any longer, so I packed up and found a new place, one that was thankfully free of ghosts. It's been almost 3 years now, but I still sometimes wake up with a start, looking over my shoulder, wondering if James and Clara are still there, carrying on with their tricks. And as silly as it sounds, I still sleep with a nightlight just in case. One thing's for sure, though, I'm happy to have put that chapter behind me. This isn't my story, it's my sister's. It happened when she was about 11 years old. She's 18 now, and it's one of those experiences that still sends chills down our spines when we talk about it. She was spending the night at her friend Cindy's house for a sleepover in our small town of Pine Lake. The night was dark, and the two of them were lying on the trampoline in Cindy's backyard. Cindy had 2 neighbors around their age, Steve and John, who were also outside that evening, hanging out on their own porch across the street. Like most kids, my sister and Cindy began joking about UFOs. They laughed about how wild it would be if they actually saw one. But they had no idea what was about to unfold, a sight neither of them could ever have imagined. My sister suddenly froze. Her face went pale. She nudged Cindy and pointed silently at something in the sky. Cindy followed her gaze, and both of them stared in shock. Hovering about 3 feet above the ground was a metallic, green pyramid. It seemed to glow softly, its edges shimmering like the reflection of distant lightning on a stormy night. It hovered there, perfectly still, completely silent, unreal. The pyramid began to drift, moving slowly from the backyard toward the front. The girls noticed Steve and John a little further down the street. They had seen it too. Without saying a word, the boys turned and ran inside their house, leaving Cindy and my sister alone with the strange object. Cindy, though terrified, made the decision to follow the pyramid. My sister, not wanting to seem afraid, followed her lead. They trailed the object as it floated across the front yard, moved into the street, and drifted down a few blocks. It turned onto another road, and just like that, it was gone, vanishing into the night. The 2 girls said nothing to each other as they walked back to Cindy's house. They were shaken, their minds racing, but the words never came. They never mentioned it again. That is, not until a year ago. Cindy had invited my sister over again, and Steve and John were there too. The 4 of them were talking when the subject of UFOs came up once more. Out of the blue, Steve said, "I saw one once, about 6 years ago. John and I were in the backyard, and there was this glowing green triangle floating about 3 feet off the ground. It moved between our houses. You remember that, right, John?" John's face changed. His eyes grew wide, and for a moment, he seemed almost scared. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I remember. We ran inside, and my mom was in the living room. She was curled up in a ball, crying and moaning, like something terrible had just happened. We couldn't get her to tell us what was wrong. She just kept mumbling. But the next day, it was like nothing ever happened. She was fine, acting completely normal." Cindy and my sister sat there in silence, horrified. The memories of that strange night came flooding back. As they pieced their stories together, it became clear they had all witnessed the same thing. The floating green pyramid, the eerie silence, the way it drifted down the streets. All of it happened on the same night. To this day, none of them know what it was. My sister, Cindy, Steve, and John still have no answers, only questions. And the weirdest part, they're not sure they want to know. Have you ever experienced something like this? If you've had a similar encounter, I'd love to hear your story. When I was 13, I'm 15 now. My family and I lived in an old house on the outskirts of a small town called Pine Lake. The house was an antique colonial, over 100 years old, full of charm and history, but there was something about it, something that went beyond what could be seen with the eyes. The most unforgettable experience I had took place on a warm summer evening. The air was thick with humidity, and a soft breeze moved through the curtains of the French doors leading to the balcony attached to my room. I had just finished my shower and was drying my hair when the cool night air caught my attention. I decided to step outside and enjoy the peace for a moment. I slid one of the doors open, leaned against the railing, and gazed up at the stars. As I stood there, I heard the familiar sound of my parents' old sedan starting up. They were heading out for the evening with my older brother. They had told me they'd be back around midnight, so it was just me in the house for a few hours. I waved them off and watched their car disappear down the long road that led out of town. I was excited to have some time alone to think and relax. After slipping into my nightgown, I made my way downstairs, passing through the quiet, creaky house. I took the long, winding staircase down to the living room and plopped down on the couch. Just as I started to settle in, a loud bang echoed from the staircase. My heart skipped a beat. The noise was so sudden and forceful that it felt like it came from within the walls. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of it, but curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed the first thing I could find, a TV remote, and slowly crept toward the staircase. What I saw next left me paralyzed with shock. Sitting on the bottom step was a young man, probably in his early 20s. He looked distant, as if lost in his own thoughts, staring off into the darkened hallway. I didn't know what to say or do, but my voice broke the silence. "Can I help you?" He looked up at me, his face softening into a small, reassuring smile. Without saying a word, he motioned for me to follow him. It was as though some invisible force had taken hold of me. I couldn't resist, so I followed. He led me upstairs, right into my bedroom. Though I was terrified, my feet moved on their own. He sat on my bed and pointed toward the closet door. I hesitated for a moment, but walked over to where he was pointing. To my shock, I saw something I had never noticed before, an engraving on the wooden frame of the closet door. It read, "This room will always be mine, Gavin." I turned back to face him, shaking. "Your name is Gavin," I whispered. He nodded with a soft smile, waved his hand in a gentle goodbye. And then, just like that, he was gone. Gavin never appeared to me physically again, but he made sure I knew he was still there. Small things began to happen. An imprint on my bed where someone had clearly been sitting, or objects shifting back into place when I was certain I hadn't touched them. At first, it was unsettling, but over time, it became strangely comforting. I realized that my room had once been his, and even in death, he hadn't quite been ready to let go of it. Now, at 15, I've long since moved away from that house, but every now and then, I still think about Gavin. Was he tied to that old house, or did he find peace after we left? Part of me hopes he's still there, lingering in the house he seemed to have loved so much. It happened about 16 years ago, and even now, it sends a shiver down my spine whenever I think about it. At the time, I was staying at the house of a family friend, Sarah, out in a quiet town near Pine Lake. Sarah and my mom had gone out for the evening, leaving me and her daughter, Emily, alone at the house. I had my little poodle, Buddy, with me. Buddy was my constant companion, always by my side, and I trusted him more than anyone else in the world. It was around 11 p.m. when Emily and I decided to call it a night. We were lying in bed, facing opposite directions, her head at one end of the bed, mine at the other. We left the radio on softly, playing some old classic tunes to help us relax, and chatted for a little while before finally drifting off to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I was suddenly awakened by Buddy growling. At first, his growls were low, almost like he was trying to warn me about something. But it quickly turned more intense, more aggressive. I thought maybe someone was walking down the road outside or a car was driving by. But as I looked around, I realized Buddy wasn't facing the window. He was growling toward the door. A feeling of dread crept over me. I began to think maybe there was someone in the house, an intruder. My heart raced as I noticed the radio, which had been playing soothing music earlier, now flickering with static, skipping through radio stations like someone was turning the dial, but never stopping on one. Buddy's growling turned into sharp snaps, like he was trying to bite something. He was lunging at the air, snapping at an invisible hand. And then, to my horror, Buddy leaped onto my chest, spreading himself out as if trying to shield me from whatever was lurking just beyond the doorway. I felt paralyzed with fear, unable to move, but Buddy was brave. He stayed close, rolling and snapping at the empty space around us. That's when I heard it, a faint buzzing whisper, like hundreds of voices speaking in unison, murmuring inaudibly. It was the most unsettling sound I've ever heard, sending chills through my body. The air felt thick, heavy, as though something dark had settled in the room with us. The kind of evil you can feel in your bones. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, watching as Buddy continued to lunge and snap at the walls, chasing something I couldn't see. What still haunts me to this day is that Emily, who was lying right next to me, slept through the entire thing. Buddy's growls were loud enough to wake the whole neighborhood, and the static from the radio was blaring so loudly it felt like the house itself was alive. But Emily never stirred, not even once. It was as though she was in some kind of trance, completely unaware of what was happening around her. Or worse, was it that the energy was targeting me, not her? I'm not sure how long it lasted, though it felt like hours. In reality, it was probably only a few minutes, but the terror felt endless. Everything stopped the moment the front door creaked open and Sarah and my mom walked in. As soon as they stepped through the door, Buddy instantly stopped growling, jumped off the bed, and ran to greet them, his tail wagging like nothing had happened. But I was still shaking, my heart racing, and my mind was reeling. After that night, I refused to stay at Sarah's house again. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had been in that room with us. No matter how much my mom or Sarah tried to convince me, I couldn't go back. What always intrigued me was Emily. She had been going through a tough time emotionally, and she was also at that age, around puberty, which I've since learned is often connected to poltergeist activity. But she didn't react at all. Was she somehow in a trance, unaware of the danger around us? Or, even scarier, was the energy really targeting me, protecting her from something far darker? To this day, I don't know what truly happened, but I do know one thing for sure. I'm eternally grateful for Buddy. My brave little dog stood between me and whatever was lurking in that room. I believe he saved me from something dark, something evil, maybe even from the touch of something beyond this world. It was supposed to be the perfect honeymoon for my husband and me. We decided to get married in the small, historic town of Silver Springs, Oregon, far from the flashing lights of big cities and bustling tourist destinations. This town, with its quiet charm, was steeped in mystery, especially with its long history of eerie events. Known for its dark woods and old Victorian homes, Silver Springs had its own tales of hauntings, strange disappearances, and whispers of long-forgotten tragedies. One such location, the old Oakwood Inn, was known throughout the town for its unsettling reputation. Locals swore the place was haunted, something about its violent past, tied to the old mining days, rumors of murders, robberies, and unsolved disappearances. Although I've always had an open mind when it comes to the supernatural, my husband was a skeptic. He'd never quite believed in ghosts, spirits, or anything that couldn't be explained away by science. So, when he decided to book us a room at the Oakwood Inn for our honeymoon, I hesitated. I'd heard the ghost stories, of course, but I figured it was just local folklore. I wasn't worried, until I saw the look in his eyes, one of excitement and mischief. He'd planned everything, from the flowers to the champagne, and all I could do was smile and go along with it. Our first night was magical. After enjoying a quiet dinner at the inn's rustic restaurant, we retreated to our room, ready to unwind. My husband, ever the skeptic, teased me about the ghost stories, claiming they were probably just a gimmick to attract tourists. I laughed along with him, even though I couldn't shake the feeling that something in the air was a bit off. But we were happy, so I pushed it aside. When we returned to our room, something strange caught my eye. The window was wide open. I could have sworn it had been closed when we first entered. I figured it was my husband, but when I asked, he shrugged and said he hadn't touched it. With the cold winter air creeping in, I shut the window and locked it. But as we settled in for the night, I heard it, the faint sound of rattling. It was coming from the window. There wasn't any wind, not that night, and it was unsettling. Thinking it was just a draft, I cracked the window open a little to stop the noise. It worked, and we went back to sleep. At 3:30 a.m., I woke up with a sudden chill. The room was freezing, and I immediately sat up in bed. To my horror, the window was open again. This time, I knew I closed it. I tried waking my husband, but he was in a deep sleep, completely oblivious. I closed the window and locked it again, frustrated but too tired to think much of it. As I drifted back off, I heard the rattling once more, but I was too exhausted to get up again. An hour later, a loud crash startled us both awake. It was so sudden and so violent, it felt like the whole room was shaking. Before we could even get out of bed, an icy wind swept through the room. It felt like a force of nature. A storm had rolled in, but there were no clouds, no rain, just a fierce, howling wind that seemed to come from nowhere. It knocked over a lamp, scattered the bed covers, and rattled the walls. Then, just as quickly as it started, it was gone. My husband and I sat there, holding each other, too stunned to speak. After a few moments, we turned on the lights to assess the damage. Strangely, nothing was broken. The lamp was intact, the vase hadn't fallen, and the window, still locked, was closed. The room was as it had been before, except for the cold that lingered in the air. No sign of the wind, no sound of glass breaking, and yet, both of us knew what had happened. Terrified, we packed our things and left immediately, spending the rest of the weekend at a friend's house. Later, I asked my husband if he had opened the window at all that night. He swore he hadn't. We never did find out what caused the strange occurrences or why that window kept opening. To this day, we've never been able to explain it. We talked to a few locals about our experience, but they didn't have any answers either. The Lockwood Inn was known for its strange happenings, but no one seemed to know anything about that particular room. My husband still doesn't believe in ghosts, but he admits that there's no logical explanation for what happened that night. As for me, I'm convinced that something, or someone, wanted that window open, and they weren't going to let us leave until it was. At least our honeymoon will always be unforgettable, though I'm not sure that's a good thing. I know how hard it is to believe in supernatural events, especially when there's no way to prove them. But what I experienced all those years ago in a small, run-down neighborhood near Buffalo was real. I can't explain it, but I'll never forget it. From a young age, I was always aware of things that most people couldn't see or feel. There were times when objects would move on their own, or I would hear voices in empty rooms. I also had this strange sense of knowing things before they happened. Even now, I try to help others with that same intuition, but the experiences I'm about to share are from a time in my life when everything felt uncertain. I was stuck in a bad marriage, living in a crumbling apartment complex in Buffalo with my 2.5-year-old daughter, Beth. The area wasn't the best, just a neighborhood of single mothers and their kids trying to get by. On one side of us was Renee and her daughter, Becky, and on the other side lived Kim with her son, Justin. What's eerie is that I wasn't the only one feeling something wasn't right. Others in the building felt it too. Beth often spoke about a little friend named Bobby who lived in her closet. At first, I thought it was just her imagination. But then, Justin began talking to someone he couldn't see too. But it was Becky who experienced the most unsettling things. Becky would wake up in the middle of the night, terrified, talking about men walking through the walls. One night she woke up crying and said a spider was trying to trick her. She calmed down for a moment, but then screamed again, saying the spider was sitting on her lap, grinning at her. Renee, desperate and frightened, came to me in the middle of the night once, asking if she and Becky could sleep on our couch. Of course, I let them stay. Then there was the night Becky woke up screaming about bad birds. She described dark, threatening birds that filled her room, and Renee started praying aloud. Suddenly, Becky said she saw good birds, ones that were bright and beautiful. She described a fierce battle between the two flocks until both vanished into thin air. While Becky's experiences were terrifying, I had my own unsettling encounters. One night, I woke up for no reason. As I opened my eyes, I saw a strange, translucent shape hovering by my bed. At first, I thought it was a balloon, maybe one my husband had brought home. But as my eyes focused, I realized it wasn't a balloon. It was something else. My heart raced as the shape drifted toward the ceiling. It turned red and then vanished into the corner, as though it was absorbed into the ceiling itself. This wasn't a one-time thing. It kept happening, night after night. The most terrifying night came when I woke up, half-dazed, and felt something brush against my lips. For a split second, I thought my husband had kissed me, but when I opened my eyes, I saw the same crinkly shape, but this time it had a face that sneered at me. The entity seemed to stretch across the entire ceiling, its form thin and unnatural. It leaned toward me, and I froze. Then just as quickly, the face grimaced, turned bright red, and was sucked into the light fixture. I screamed, and my husband rushed in. He didn't see what I saw, but he believed me because I'd been telling him about these strange events for months. I spoke to Renee and Kim about the encounters, and Kim told me she often saw dark shadows or even massive spiders crawling on her walls. Like the strange forms I saw, these shadows would often disappear into the light fixtures. Kim was so unnerved that she hung rosaries and crucifixes all over her apartment for protection. Kim later told me something that sent a chill down my spine. She mentioned that the building had once been built on land that used to be a landfill. She believed that many animals had died there, and their restless spirits still lingered. I'm not sure if I buy that theory, but I know something about that place wasn't right. Looking back, I can't explain what happened to us in that apartment. Was it tied to the building, the land, or something deeper? I don't know. But I do know this. Whatever it was, it left an impression that I'll never shake. And even though I still don't have answers, I find comfort in knowing that I wasn't alone in experiencing it. It was the summer of 1991, and I had just turned 13. Most of my days during the school holidays were spent hanging out at the local pool with my best friend, Rochelle, and the rest of our crew. Those summer days felt endless, carefree, and full of laughter. One evening, I invited Rochelle to spend the night at my house. I thought it would be fun to wake up early, grab some breakfast, and then walk to the pool together. She agreed without hesitation. We stayed up late, talking about the usual things: school, friends, and boys. I was stretched out on my bed, while Rochelle made herself comfortable on a mattress on the floor. Eventually, sleep overtook us, and I drifted off almost instantly. The next morning, as we were getting ready, Rochelle asked me a strange question. "Was the cat inside last night?" she asked, her voice shaky. I was confused. "Why do you ask?" She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the floor as she spoke. "Well, last night, as I was trying to sleep, I looked under your bed and saw these small, green, glowing eyes. At first, I freaked out, but then I saw them blink. I thought it was your cat, so I called out to it. But it turned away, and I fell asleep after that." My stomach dropped. I looked at her in silence, my voice barely a whisper. "Rochelle, my cat's been dead for almost a year." We didn't speak of it again after that night. It was just one of those strange, unsettling things you try to forget. But recently, it all came rushing back. A few months ago, in the dead of night, I woke up to a faint tapping sound coming from under my bed. It wasn't constant, just a few taps, followed by silence, then more taps. My heart pounded in my chest as memories of that summer night flooded back. I stayed still, frozen under the covers, until morning came. When I checked under my bed, there was nothing. No sign of what could have caused the noise. A few days later, even stranger things started happening. One evening, I was blow-drying my hair in my bedroom when I felt a strange vibration under the floorboards. It was odd. It only seemed to be under my right foot. The vibrations grew stronger, and then, without warning, the hairdryer shut off. My mind raced as I stood there, trying to process what had just happened. And then, out of nowhere, the lid to my hair straightener flew off the dressing table and crashed behind it. I didn't stick around to find out what caused it. I ran out of the room. Another night, while my boyfriend was over, we were watching TV in my bedroom when we were about to step outside for a cigarette. He set his phone down on a small stool while I put on my shoes. Suddenly, the phone turned on by itself, locked the keypad, and then unlocked it again. His eyes went wide, and he said, "Did you see that?" Oh my God. I tried to laugh it off, feeling uneasy, and told him to come outside. These events weren't terrifying, but they were enough to make me uneasy. What bothered me even more were the experiences my younger brother and sister had in the house. Both of them had felt intense pressure on their chests while lying in bed, unable to move. My sister even claimed she felt hot, ragged breathing on her ear during one of these episodes. She was certain she was awake. She clenched her teeth, desperate to wake up from what she thought might be a dream. Just thinking about it now gives me chills. It makes me wonder, what, if anything, might happen next. Hey everyone. I put a lot of effort and heart into creating these videos just for you. If you're enjoying the content, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a quick comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Your support means the world to me, and it keeps me motivated to bring more awesome videos your way. This story happened to me a couple of years ago during a trip to New Orleans. My friends and I decided to take a break and head to the Gulf Coast for a few days, excited to explore the culture and history of the city. We planned to stay for a week, and the first few days were everything you'd expect, enjoying the food, taking in the sights, meeting locals, and soaking up the lively atmosphere. It was perfect. On the fourth day, we decided to change things up and head into the French Quarter for some sightseeing and shopping. Everything felt normal and fun, at least until we visited one of the city's most famous landmarks, the Street Louis Cemetery No. 1. The cemetery is massive, almost like its own small neighborhood, and a place where you could easily get lost if you didn't know your way around. We joined a daytime tour, admiring the old tombs and crypts. Unlike the flat headstones I was used to back home, these were towering mausoleums and crypts, perched high off the ground. The grandeur of it all was breathtaking, but there was one particular crypt that caught my attention. The guide led us to La Llorona. The statue was unlike the others, which depicted angels or saints. This one showed a woman seated, her arms outstretched, her face full of sorrow. It felt almost out of place. I found it unsettling, but didn't mention it at the time. The next evening, as the trip was winding down, I decided to return to the cemetery alone. My friends were resting, and I wanted to take one last look at that crypt. I walked the few miles to the cemetery, hoping to find the guide, but when I arrived, the place was nearly deserted. A lone security guard stood at the gate, and when I asked about the guide, he just shrugged and motioned for me to enter. Determined, I followed the map toward La Llorona. The cemetery felt eerily quiet, and I was the only one there. When I reached the crypt, the atmosphere around me felt strange, not cold or physical, just unsettling. The legend surrounding the crypt came to mind. They say the woman was once an ordinary mother, filled with joy at the birth of her first child. But that joy turned to heartbreak when the doctors told her the baby had been stillborn. She grieved for days, inconsolable. On the day of the burial, as the priest sealed the casket, she begged to hold her baby one final time. People thought she had lost her sanity, but as she held the lifeless child, A piercing cry echoed through the cemetery. The baby had miraculously come back to life. Locals believe it was the power of a mother's love. To this day, people come to La Llorona to ask for blessings or favors. Standing there alone, I decided to do the same. I asked for the recovery of a relative who had been unwell. But even as I made my request, something felt off. I wasn't cold, and nothing physically touched me, but there was a creeping sensation of unease that I couldn't shake. I returned to the hotel, trying to push the feeling aside. The next day, as we packed to leave, I had almost forgotten about the experience. But when I got back home, something strange happened. My relative's health had dramatically improved during my trip. It was as if they'd gotten better overnight. I was relieved, but I couldn't help feeling uneasy. Then, when I developed the photos from the trip, everything appeared normal at first. But when I compared the pictures of the 2 visits to the cemetery, my stomach turned. The statue had changed. In the group tour photo, the woman's hands were gently cradling the child. But in the photo I'd taken on my own, one of her hands was pointing to the sky, while the other still rested on the child. I couldn't believe my eyes. I stared at the photos for hours, trying to make sense of it, but there was no logical explanation. Fear gripped me, and I burned the pictures. I didn't tell anyone, not my friends, not my family. I didn't want to risk bringing anything dark into my life or inviting nightmares. This is the first time I've shared this story. Even now, I can't explain what happened, but if you ever find yourself in New Orleans and you're feeling brave enough, you can visit La Llorona for yourself. Maybe you'll find the answers that I couldn't. It was about 10 years ago now, but the memory of that night is still as clear as day. It happened on a Friday evening, right as September was winding down and October was just beginning. The exact date doesn't matter. It's what happened that night that stayed with me. My girlfriend, Sarah, and I had planned a quiet weekend getaway at my uncle's cabin near the coast. He always let us use it in the off-season, and even though the summer crowds had gone home, we loved the calmness of the area during the fall. The empty streets, the chill in the air, and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore all helped us unwind and forget about the stress of the week. Earlier that day, my friend Jason called. He was looking for a ride. His girlfriend was visiting family in a nearby town, and he thought he'd come with us. It wasn't much of a detour, so I agreed. The drive was around 2 hours, not bad at all. When we picked up Jason, Sarah, who had been feeling a little off, insisted he sit in the front. "I'm tired," she said. "I'll probably fall asleep." And she did, not even 5 minutes into the drive. Jason and I talked for a while, but as the miles passed, the conversation slowed down. It was late, and we were both getting tired. By the time we reached the outskirts of our destination, we were in the final stretch, heading toward a quiet town near the bay. The road was narrow and wound through dense woods, with barely any streetlights. The night had settled in completely, and the headlights from the car only illuminated a few feet ahead. Sarah was still asleep, and Jason and I barely exchanged words, both of us ready for rest. And then it happened. Out of the shadows, right in the beam of the headlights, a figure appeared. It was a boy, maybe 14, maybe 15, standing still in the middle of the road. He didn't move, didn't react. He simply stood there, staring at us, his face expressionless. There was no urgency in his posture, no sense of fear, nothing. He just stared at us, as if he had no idea what danger he was in. What happened next felt surreal, like everything was moving in fast forward. 1 second, the boy was standing at the edge of the headlights, and the next, he was directly in front of the car, so close I could see every detail. His messy, dirty blonde hair, his worn-out clothes, faded jeans, old sneakers, and a flannel shirt that looked like it had seen better days. And then, as if gravity itself couldn't hold him down, he was lifted slightly into the air. His face came up to the windshield, but his expression never changed. His eyes, those sunken, emptied eyes, locked onto mine. There was no emotion in them, just hollow, lifeless stare. It felt like his gaze was cutting right through me. In an instant, he dropped back down, parallel to the ground, and then he was gone. I looked in the rearview mirror, and for a brief second, I saw him again, standing in the middle of the road, facing the back of the car. His face was swallowed by the darkness, but I knew it was him. I glanced back at the road, and when I looked in the mirror again, he had disappeared completely. Jason and I sat in complete silence, our breath caught in our throats. Finally, we both muttered at the same time, "What the hell was that?" The noise woke Sarah from her sleep, and she sat up groggily. "What happened?" she asked, trying to process the words, but she wasn't interested in the details. To her, it was just another weird thing that would fade from memory by the morning. Jason and I, though, couldn't shake it. We've talked about it a few times since, but we both agree on one thing. If you weren't there, if you didn't see it with your own eyes, you could never truly understand. The boy's empty stare, the way he vanished so suddenly, it's something that doesn't make sense, and it's something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. I have two stories to share, one from my mom and one from myself. Neither of them are terrifying in the traditional sense, but there's something oddly captivating about them. Strange and inexplicable as they are, it's up to you to decide whether they're just coincidences or if something deeper is at play. My mom has always had peculiar experiences with the dead, especially with those she was closest to. She's told me countless stories of seeing both of her grandfathers after they passed, along with her own father. She's even said that before we were born, my siblings and I visited her in dreams. But the experience I want to share happened about 6 months ago, and it has to do with my grandfather. It had been 2 years since my grandfather passed, and during that time, our family had gone through a lot. To say things were tense would be an understatement. My mom's oldest brother, Mike, had always lived at home with my grandmother. After my grandfather passed, my cousin Bethany, my Uncle Ken's daughter, moved in. Bethany had always been treated like the family's golden child. My relatives tried to make up for her parents' divorce by spoiling her, but it only made things worse. Over the years, she grew selfish, manipulative, and hard to get along with. Eventually, things came to a breaking point when Bethany and Uncle Mike got into a fight one day while my grandma was out. The details aren't clear, but it ended with Bethany calling the police and pressing assault charges against Mike. The trial was long and painful for everyone. Most of the family, except for my mom, testified in Mike's favor. But even after the trial ended, the damage was done. It felt like our family was falling apart, and it seemed like there was no way to repair it. Then one evening, my mom had what she described as a vivid dream, or maybe it was something more. In the dream, she saw my grandfather. They were in a room where my grandmother sat on a couch. My mom watched as my grandfather approached my grandmother. My grandma looked at him confused, then turned away, as if she didn't want to acknowledge him. My grandfather then walked over to my mom, his eyes filled with sorrow. He told her he couldn't rest until the family found peace with each other. This wasn't the first time my mom had encountered my grandfather after his passing, but it was the most emotional and unsettling. Shaken by the dream, she wrote a heartfelt letter to the family, urging them to come together. She also shared the experience with my grandmother, who, to my mom's surprise, admitted she too had seen and spoken to my grandfather since his death. While my mom's experiences are tied to the spiritual, mine lean more toward the psychic. They aren't as dramatic, but they left me pondering the nature of these odd moments. The first incident occurred when I took my car to get fixed. The shop kept giving me the runaround about when it would be ready, and I was starting to feel stressed. One night, I had a dream that they painted the car a garish orange, with a rough texture like a truck bed liner. I woke up feeling uneasy, but I tried to brush it off. The next night, I had another dream. This time, the car was painted white. I told myself it was just my nerves, but on Monday, when the shop called, they admitted they had painted the car the wrong color and would have to fix it. I was stunned. Another incident happened a few days later when a friend of mine was staying over after surgery. On my way home from lunch, I had a vivid vision of her doing the dishes in my kitchen. It felt like a random thought, so I didn't think much of it. When I got home, she was still asleep, so I figured I was just imagining things. But later, when my husband came home, the kitchen was spotless. The dishes were done. I couldn't explain it. The strangest part of all this, when I shared these experiences with my mom, she passed the stories on to my dad. His reaction was unexpected. He became very serious and told her that his grandmother used to have visions that often came true. I'm not sure if these experiences are some sort of gift passed down through the family or just bizarre coincidences. They aren't exactly scary, but they make me wonder about the connections we share that can't be seen. Whatever the explanation, they leave me both unsettled and deeply curious. "5 years ago, my boyfriend Michael and I, along with another couple, decided to take a break from the chaos of New York City and spend Easter in a quiet, secluded cabin in the mountains of North Carolina. A friend's family owned the cabin, and they kindly let us use it for the weekend, so we packed our bags and set off, eager for a relaxing escape. The cabin was everything you'd expect from a cozy mountain retreat. A charming, centuries-old farmhouse built in the early 1800s. It had a small living room downstairs with a wood-burning stove, rustic charm, and only a single bathroom upstairs. The area was peaceful during the day, with birds chirping and fresh mountain air. But once night fell, something changed. The thick, inky darkness surrounding the cabin made it feel more isolated, and strange things began to happen. At night, we started hearing odd noises. The floorboards above us creaked as if someone were walking around. Doors opened and shut on their own. Lights flickered and dimmed for no reason, and the old pipes groaned like they were under pressure. We figured it was just the quirks of an old house. But then, we began noticing things moving on their own. Michael's car keys, which we were certain we'd left on the table, had mysteriously appeared on the kitchen counter, and the dishes that had been scattered on the floor were now neatly stacked in the sink. It was as if someone was tidying up, but we all assumed it was one of us doing it absent-mindedly. About halfway through our trip, we decided to visit a nearby lake that had a reputation for strange legends and eerie tales from local folklore. We piled into the car and spent a few hours exploring the lake, taking in the beauty of the area. By noon, we stopped at a small rustic pub near the lake for a bite to eat. While waiting for our meal, we ran into a few friends who were in town for a wedding. One of them, an old friend of Michael's, approached him and said, "Hey, we're so glad we found you. We thought we might catch up with you here after we couldn't find you at the lake." Michael was confused. "I don't understand," he said. "How did you know we were at the lake today?" Our friend smiled and answered nonchalantly, "A woman at your cabin told us. We knocked on the door, and she answered. She said you'd gone to the lake and even gave us directions to get here." We froze. There was no one else staying at the cabin. We were sure of it. There wasn't a caretaker or housekeeper, and the cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor. We didn't speak much after that, but the drive back to the cabin was unnervingly quiet. When we arrived, everything seemed normal at first, but the air felt heavier, thicker with tension. We spent the rest of the week there, but the nights were far more difficult to get through after that conversation. Back in New York, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, so I decided to look into the cabin's history. To my surprise, I found out that the last permanent resident was an elderly farmer's wife who had lived there until her death in 1936. Since then, the cabin had only been used as a vacation home. Even now, we share this story with our friends, and it sparks heated debates. Who had the more chilling experience? Was it us, staying in a house where objects moved on their own? Or was it our friends, who were given directions to the lake by someone who, by all accounts, must have been a ghost? It was the fall of my 15th year, and I had always heard stories, ghost tales shared by friends, family, and even late-night TV shows. But back then, I never thought much of them. I wasn't a skeptic, but I wasn't a believer either. I simply didn't have an opinion. That all changed the morning I lost my father. It happened so suddenly. It was one of those early mornings in October when the chill in the air cuts through your bones. My mother had been in the hospital for a routine procedure, and my father, my older brother Jake, and I were home. My dad suffered a massive heart attack. They rushed him to the hospital. the same one my mom was in. My brother rode in the ambulance, while I stayed behind, feeling a sense of dread settle over me. Not long after, my mom's surgery was canceled, and she returned home with Jake. But my father, he didn't make it. One minute, he was there, laughing at something silly, and the next, he was gone. We didn't get the chance to say goodbye. It felt like the world had shifted under my feet. The days that followed were a blur, as if I was walking through life in a fog. We tried to move on, but it wasn't the same. Everything felt hollow. But there was one night that I'll never forget. It was a quiet evening, just me, alone in the living room, watching an old black and white film. I had barely been able to focus on the screen when I noticed a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye. I turned, but nothing was there. It was like seeing the shadow of something that vanished the second you focused on it. A chill ran down my spine. My heart started to race. Without thinking, I bolted up and rushed into the kitchen, where my mother was preparing dinner. She looked up and asked if I was okay. I lied, standing there in silence as she continued chopping vegetables. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Grief, perhaps, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few nights later, the same sensation hit me again. I was in my bedroom, listening to music with my headphones on. My mom had fallen asleep downstairs, wrapped in a blanket on the couch. She hadn't been able to sleep in their bed since Dad passed. The soft glow from my nightlight was the only source of illumination. Then it happened again. Something small and dark raced across my room, faster than I could follow. It was like a blur of shadow that darted across the floor and disappeared before I could even make sense of it. This wasn't my imagination. I could feel my pulse quicken as the fear took hold. I ripped off my headphones and bolted down the stairs without thinking, heart pounding in my chest. I burst into the living room, breathless, and without meaning to, I blurted, "Are you okay?" My mom looked at me with confusion and said, "No." I sat next to her, and she explained she hadn't been feeling well. I didn't tell her what I had just seen. She didn't ask why I was suddenly so frantic either. I don't even know why I asked her. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe I just needed to hear her voice. The next day, it didn't leave my mind. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Grief messes with you like that. I didn't want to worry my mom any more than she already was, so I kept it to myself. I didn't tell anyone. I was afraid they'd think I was just imagining it all. But then everything changed. My boyfriend, Kyle, came over. We were in the room we always called the best room, a cozy space in the back of the house, with walls lined with old family portraits and shelves full of books. We were talking to my mom, and in the middle of her sentence, she suddenly froze. Her eyes darted to the corner of the room, wide with alarm. My heart dropped. A cold shiver swept over me, and I could hear the pounding of my own pulse. She quickly brushed it off and continued talking, but I couldn't ignore it. I pulled her aside, my voice shaking, and asked, "What was that? What did you see?" After a long moment of hesitation, she finally admitted, "I'm not sure. I thought I saw something. It was small, dark, and moved quickly." She seemed uneasy, uncomfortable. I could feel my stomach drop, and then, without warning, the tears came. I cried in front of my mom and Kyle for the first time since Dad had passed. They stared at me in confusion. I told them everything, how I had seen the same shadowy figure several times, and that maybe I wasn't losing my mind after all. Hearing her confirm what I had seen was both a relief and a terror. I wasn't crazy. My mom understood why I had been acting strangely, why I'd rushed into the kitchen that night or hurried downstairs in the middle of the night. After that, the shadow never appeared again. I saw it 3 times, and my mom saw it once. We talked about it, trying to make sense of it. In the end, we both agreed. It must have been my dad, finding some way to say goodbye. I mean, what else could it have been? That was nearly 20 years ago, and to this day, I've never had an experience like that again. But I still wonder, have you ever experienced something like that? Something brief, something fleeting, yet somehow unforgettable, because I don't think I'll ever forget it. My grandmother, Margaret, is 78 years old, and ever since my grandfather passed away a few years ago, she's been living on her own. After his death, I moved in with her to help her adjust and keep her company. Her house has always been a bit of an enigma. Built in the 1950s by my grandfather in a small, quiet town in Oregon, the house has a rustic charm, but also a slightly eerie feel. The walls are made from old barnwood, and it creaks at night, as if the house is alive in some way. There are only 7 rooms in total, and when I stayed with her, I slept in the living room, right under the large windows that looked out into the thick woods behind the house. Although I loved being there for her, I've never been fully comfortable in that house, especially at night. It wasn't until I spent my first night there that I realized just how unsettling the house could be. The air felt too hot, and my breathing became heavier, almost suffocating. There were strange noises coming from what we called the back room, scratching sounds on the walls that seemed to grow louder the longer I lay awake. Despite my attempts to stay calm, fear crept in. Eventually, I couldn't stand it anymore and crawled into bed with my grandmother. Only then did sleep take me. I spent more nights there, slowly getting used to the house's oddities. Late nights watching TV turned into brief, restless hours of sleep before starting the next day. But there was one night, one that still sends chills down my spine when I think about it. It was around 11 p.m. that evening when I turned off the TV and tried to sleep. As I was drifting off, I heard the static of a television. My eyes shot open confused. It wasn't the living room TV. It was coming from the back room, where I had left an old television I'd brought from home. The thing had no cable or antenna. It was only used to play video games. But there it was, the soft hum of the TV, followed by faint voices behind the static. The words were distorted, indecipherable. I panicked. The idea of walking into that room alone terrified me, so I woke my grandmother. She got up without a word and followed me. Just as we walked into the living room on our way to the back room, the TV cut off abruptly. My heart was racing as I finally went into the back room. I unplugged the TV, even though it had no reason to be on. It was the only way I could convince myself I'd be able to sleep that night. The voices left me uneasy. They weren't loud enough to make out, but they felt deliberate, like something, or someone, was trying to reach out. I've never figured out what it meant, but it's a feeling that haunts me. While that was my only direct experience, my grandmother has had many more. Long before I moved in, when my grandfather was still alive, she used to wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of a baby crying. The house was quiet. No children lived there anymore. Her own kids had long since grown and moved out. It became even stranger when I learned more about my aunt's tragic past. My aunt, who had once lived in that house, had lost 2 children just days after they were born. It was heartbreaking to think about, and we began to wonder if the cries were the spirits of those lost babies, mourning the lives they never had the chance to live. One night after my grandfather had passed, my grandma had another strange experience. I wasn't living there at the time, but she told me about the night she saw a green glow coming from the corner of her room. She said the lights were small and floating, like tiny orbs of green light. Strangely, they didn't frighten her. If anything, they seemed to offer a sense of calm. She watched them hover in the corner before they faded out, leaving no trace. My father, always trying to make sense of things, suggested they might have been the spirit of someone trying to reassure her, though no one really knows what those lights were. These experiences have stuck with me for years. What could the green lights have been? And what about the baby's cries, so haunting yet so distant? If anyone reading this has experienced anything similar or knows what might have caused it, I'd love to hear from you. The more I think about it, the more I realize that there's something in that old house, a presence, a force that may never fully reveal itself. There are a lot of strange and unnerving things that have happened to me over the years, but there's one particular experience that stands out above all the others. Even though it happened more than 12 years ago, I can still remember it like it happened just yesterday. I was only 8 years old at the time, and my family had traveled down to the small town of Pine Lake, Texas, for my uncle's wedding. After the ceremony, My uncle arranged for us to stay at the home of one of his old friends, a woman named Maria. It was an old house on the outskirts of town, far from the busy streets, surrounded by thick woods and an eerie stillness, the kind of place you'd expect to find in a ghost story. When we arrived, Maria welcomed us warmly, introducing us to one of her maids, who was tasked with showing us to our room. We followed her through the house, down a long, narrow hallway that creaked underfoot. The walls were lined with antique portraits, their eyes seeming to follow us as we walked. At the end of the hall were several doors, each leading to a room, most of them already occupied. But there was one door that seemed different. It was at the far end of the hallway, tucked away in shadow. The room behind it looked dark, and something about it made me feel uneasy. The maid led us to that very room. She opened the door, revealing an old, dusty space that hadn't been used in years. Most of the furniture was covered in faded blankets, the air thick with the musty scent of forgotten memories. There was no light in the room, save for an oil lamp that Maria had left for us to use. Despite the oddity of it all, we didn't have much choice. The other rooms were already taken, so we settled in. At first, everything seemed quiet, the kind of silence that only happens in the middle of the night in a house far from town. But as I began to drift off, the dogs outside began barking, loudly, and in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We brushed it off, thinking it was just the local dogs barking at the night. But then, the barking stopped, and that's when we heard it. It started as a faint sound, footsteps, but not from the hallway, no. These steps were coming from above, from the roof. My dad shrugged it off, saying it was probably just the rain, though the night sky was clear, with no clouds in sight. The wind hadn't picked up either, but the footsteps grew louder. He finally decided to step outside and check. When he went out, the air was calm, the sky was clear. There was no rain, no wind, and no sign of anything that could explain the sounds. He looked up at the roof but saw nothing. He came back inside and reassured us that everything was fine. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The footsteps stopped, and there was a moment of silence. But then, a new sound emerged, not from the roof, but from within the room itself. Furniture began to move, scraping against the wooden floors with a low, groaning sound. Then came the breathing, a deep, raspy breath that sounded too close. My little brother screamed, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. Then it happened. The bed, our bed, shifted. We felt it lift, just for a moment, before one of the mattresses was yanked completely out from underneath us. All of us tumbled to the floor in a scramble of panic. I thought I might faint from fear. My dad grabbed my brother and rushed to the door. My mom held on to me, and we all ran out into the hallway, screaming in terror. There we found Maria, standing with her pale face, staring at us as though she had already known something was wrong. She quickly apologized, but there was no explanation for what had just happened. She said she'd find us another room to stay in, but her voice was shaky. She didn't ask any questions, and she never mentioned the strange room again. The next morning, when we told my uncle about the events, he didn't believe us at first. But then, an older man who had been sitting near me joined in. His face was grim as he listened to our account. He leaned in and told us a story about a woman who had lived in the area in the late 1800s. She was rumored to have been a witch, practicing dark magic and sacrificing people in rituals to appease Satan. The townspeople found out, and in their fury, they burned her alive. But as she was dying, she cursed the land. She swore that anyone who stayed near her home would suffer the consequences. We still don't know exactly what happened that night, but every time I think about it, I can feel that same cold chill creeping back into my bones. It's as if that memory, and whatever happened in that room, is still out there waiting. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. When I was around 16 years old, just a few years ago, something happened that still unsettles me to this day. I've thought about it countless times, but I still can't explain what happened or why it happened. Here's my story. It was a quiet Saturday morning, and I woke up in my room, which was in the basement of our old house. The house was unusually still, so I decided to head upstairs and make some breakfast. I felt like something was off, so I started looking around to see if anyone else was home. Eventually, I found my sister-in-law sitting in my mom's room, working on the computer. Feeling a bit more at ease, I went back to the kitchen and started making bacon, eggs, and toast. While I was buttering the toast, something strange happened. Our microwave is on a shelf right above the counter, at eye level, so I could see the reflection of the room behind me in its glass. Out of nowhere, I got this sudden cold feeling, like a chill running down my spine. It wasn't like I was thinking about anything creepy, but the air felt wrong, like something wasn't right. Curious, I glanced into the microwave's reflection. From that angle, I could see the kitchen and the small staircase leading down to the front door. And that's when I saw him, a little boy, walking slowly up the stairs. He was wearing a faded gray hoodie and black sweatpants, with a short buzz cut. He was staring down at his feet as he climbed the stairs, gripping the railing with one hand, taking slow, deliberate steps. At first, I just thought, who is this kid? But then, when he reached the top of the stairs, he paused. And suddenly, he snapped his head up to look directly at me. That's when I saw it. He had no face. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, featureless skin. My heart stopped. I froze, staring in complete shock. Then, as if things couldn't get worse, his head jerked toward me, and he started running straight toward me through the reflection. Even though he had no face, I could feel his anger, his rage. It was like he was coming for me. Panic took over. I spun around as fast as I could to look at the stairs in real life, but there was nothing there. When I turned back to the microwave, though he was still coming at me, closer and closer, he was only a few feet away in the reflection, and I couldn't move. Terrified, I scrambled up onto the counter, pulling my feet up and sitting there, shaking. The bacon started burning, but I didn't care. I was too afraid to even touch the floor. For at least 10 minutes, I stayed there, frozen, too scared to move. Eventually, I yelled for my sister-in-law to come into the kitchen. When she saw me sitting there, she burst out laughing. I probably looked ridiculous, but I didn't care. I told her everything that had just happened and begged her to stay with me while I finished cooking. So we made breakfast together. Later, when my mom came home, I told her what had happened. She listened carefully and said, "Maybe it was your little brother playing tricks on you." You see, my little brother had passed away before I was born. But I told her, I don't think people keep growing after they die. She didn't say anything else, and I was left wondering what, or who, that boy could have been. That wasn't the last strange occurrence in that house. Another time, I had a friend over. We were sitting in the basement, just chatting. I was facing her, and she was looking toward the door. Suddenly, she jumped up and ran to the far corner of the room, looking terrified. I asked her, "What's wrong?" She pointed toward the door and said, "I just saw a little kid run past it." Her words made my stomach drop, instantly reminding me of the boy I'd seen in the kitchen. I ran to the corner with her, and we worked up the courage to open the door and race up the stairs, not stopping until we were outside in the daylight, away from the house. I shared this story with someone once, and they told me something that made my skin crawl. They said that children's spirits are different from others. They can be unpredictable, acting out like real children, throwing tantrums, or mischief if they don't get their way. That thought made me even more uncomfortable around them. I don't know what they're capable of, and honestly, I don't want to find out. So that's my story. I hope it's not too long for you. Even now, I get chills when I think about that boy with no face. What do you think happened that day? Have you ever experienced something like that? I grew up in a small town in Oregon, tucked away among the misty woods and rolling hills. Back then, I never really believed in ghosts or the supernatural. Sure, I loved helping my friends hold seances and telling creepy stories about local legends, just harmless fun, or so I thought. But everything changed after a few terrifying encounters of my own. The house I grew up in had no strange history. It was a new build when we moved in, and there were no eerie tales attached to the land around it. Or so we thought. But what happened inside that house is something I'll never forget. The first encounter happened when I was in 7th grade. My best friend, Emily, and I decided to throw a slumber party. We invited all the girls in our grade, and eventually, the night turned into a session of ghost stories. Emily and I came up with a spine-chilling tale to scare everyone. We told them that, years ago, during the construction of our house, a man named Thomas had been murdered on the site. His killers buried him beneath the concrete to hide the crime, and his spirit was now trapped in the basement. It worked. Every girl at the party believed us. They were terrified, especially considering we were sleeping right there in the basement. My basement was huge, an open space with just one small room, the furnace room. From where we lay, we could see everything. That night, there were 3 girls on the bed and 6 more sleeping on the floor. Around 3 a.m., one of the girls screamed, waking us all. She said she saw something in the corner of the room, a faint white glow tinged with purple. She couldn't make out what it was, but she said it felt wrong, like pure evil. The rest of us were in a panic and scrambled onto the bed, trying to calm down, hoping to fall back asleep. But it didn't stop there. An hour later, 2 more girls screamed. Amanda said something had grabbed her ankle, and Jennifer swore she felt something grip her arm. Both of them had bright red marks where they were touched. That was it. We grabbed our blankets and fled upstairs to sleep on the living room floor, too scared to go back down. At the time, I thought they were all just messing with me, but a few years later, I had an experience that made me question everything. When I was 16, Emily, Becky, and I decided to have another sleepover in the basement. We stayed up late watching movies, talking about school, and joking about how we had scared the others at that slumber party with our made-up story about Thomas. Becky laughed along, even though she hadn't been there. Eventually, we turned off the lights and went to sleep. But around 3:30 a.m., Becky shook me awake. She whispered that there was something in the corner of the basement. I opened my eyes, and the moment I looked over, my body went cold. In the corner of the room, there was a figure. It was tall, with a misty white outline, faintly glowing purple. It wasn't moving, but it was definitely watching us. I couldn't scream or move. I was completely paralyzed. I nudged Emily awake, and the 3 of us lay there, huddled together, frozen in fear. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to shout. The moment I did, the figure vanished. We bolted upstairs without saying a word, too terrified to look back. We were shaking, gasping for breath, but we didn't dare return to the basement. You'd think that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. I think confronting that figure made it angry. It came back for me. About 2 weeks later, I was asleep in my room. It was a school night, and I had gone to bed early. I was having a strange dream, fighting against something I couldn't see. I could feel myself swinging my arms, struggling to break free. Then suddenly, I woke up, and I couldn't breathe. Something was choking me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its hands around my neck. I gasped for air, flailing, trying to break free. Then I felt myself being lifted off the bed. I thought I was going to die. In my panic, I knocked over my bedside lamp, and the crash must have startled it because I was suddenly dropped. My parents heard the noise and rushed to my room. When they saw me, my mom started crying. My neck was red and bruised, and my stomach and back were scratched up. The bruises were shaped like handprints. Something had definitely been there. That was the breaking point. My parents moved me to the spare bedroom that night, and by the end of the week, they put the house up for sale. That's when they told me something I didn't know before. Apparently, my older brother had gone through something similar years earlier when he was home from college. He'd been choked and scratched too, but at the time, my parents thought he had just hurt himself. After seeing what happened to me, they realized it wasn't him. We moved out shortly after, but even now, I can't forget what happened in that house. Whatever it was, I hope I never cross paths with it again. I'm a freshman at Hampton University, one of the most renowned historically black colleges in the United States. The campus is rich with history, and walking through its grounds feels like traveling back in time. At the heart of this history stands the iconic James Hall, the main residence hall on campus, a monument to strength and resilience. It's named after the original Hampton Singers, a group of extraordinary students who, in the late 1800s, saved the school from financial ruin. They toured across the nation, raising money with their soulful performances, and eventually raised enough to build James Hall itself. Their efforts were so profound that when they sang for President Roosevelt, he had a portrait commissioned to honor them. That priceless painting now hangs in the main hallway of James Hall, directly beneath my room. And I think that painting might be the source of my problem. Despite its cultural and historical significance, the painting hangs exposed with no protective covering or security around it. One evening, my roommate and I decided to take a closer look. We crossed the thin velvet rope surrounding the painting, eager to inspect it up close. As I leaned in, I noticed small streaks of white paint marring one of the singers' faces, likely from an accidental splatter in the room above. I felt a wave of frustration. How could something so important be treated with such disregard? Without thinking, I reached out and tried to scratch the paint off her face. When it didn't budge, I muttered a few choice words under my breath and left with my roommate. The next morning, I woke up to a long, thin scratch on my forehead. I hadn't noticed it the night before, and what struck me as odd was how it was already healed, forming a neat, thin scab. I brushed it off as nothing, but a few days later, the scratch vanished without a trace, as if it had never been there. One evening, my friends and I were gathered, talking about how we thought James Hall might be haunted. Most of the stories were light-hearted, and we laughed at the thought of ghosts walking the halls. But when I shared my story, the atmosphere shifted, the laughter stopped, and my friends listened closely. When I told them what I had done to the painting, their faces turned serious. The next morning, I woke up to another scratch, this time on my left cheek. Again, it was long, thin, and perfectly healed. When I told my friends, they were horrified and insisted I stay in their rooms for the night. I declined, telling myself it was just a coincidence. That night, though, was anything but restful. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong as I lay in bed. Just as I felt myself slipping into sleep, a loud thud echoed from my closet door. My heart raced as I stared at it, listening. A few seconds later, I heard the creak of the door slowly opening. I held my breath, frozen in place. The moment I exhaled, the door stopped moving. I didn't dare close my eyes again until the first light of dawn crept in. Like before, the scratch on my cheek disappeared in a few days, but the feeling of unease lingered. That was about a month ago. While the scratches haven't returned, I still have nights of restless sleep and a persistent feeling that I'm not alone. People often say that the spirit world runs deep within the walls of James Hall, and after everything I've experienced, I can't help but agree. I'm a believer now. I've been working at my new office for about 6 months now. At first, everything seemed normal. The building was like any other workplace, and I didn't give it much thought. But about 3 or 4 months ago, strange things began to happen, and it's been unsettling ever since. The first sign I noticed was a sound, something moving inside the walls around my office. At first, it didn't seem like anything alarming. I assumed it was just mice. I reported it to the maintenance crew, and they came by to check for rodents or set up traps. They didn't find anything unusual. Soon after, I began hearing tapping on the door frame leading to my office. It would happen at random times, just soft, distinct knocks. I figured it was probably someone playing a prank on me, so I got up to check, but the hallway was always empty. I told myself it was probably just the pipes or some other harmless explanation. Then came the radios. There's a small utility room I passed through to get to my office, and inside, there's a table with 2 radios sitting on it. One morning, one of the radios turned itself on. I assumed it was faulty, but when I checked, I noticed it was unplugged. The switch was off too. That sent a chill down my spine. I quickly shut my office door, hoping whatever was causing the radio to act up wouldn't follow me inside. But even with the door shut, I could still hear it turning on and off. Around lunchtime, I ran into one of the maintenance guys and asked him to check out the radio. He opened it up, found corroded batteries inside, and said it should be fine now. I felt a little relieved, so I went back to my office, but the peace didn't last long. Later that day, the second radio started doing the same thing, turning itself on and off. This time, I decided to investigate. I picked up the second radio, trying to figure out what was going on. That's when I noticed something strange. This radio didn't even have a place for batteries, and it wasn't plugged in. By this point, I had no idea what to think. The tapping, the noises in the walls, the radios, it was all too strange to ignore. But these things kept happening over the next month, and eventually, I got used to it. That's when something new started, the printer. One day, I was typing up a memo for the office and hit print. Instead of printing the memo, the printer spat out 5 pages of random symbols. The text was replaced with strange fonts like wingdings, and none of it made any sense. I tried again, but the same thing happened. It felt as though someone, or something, was tampering with my work. That was when I decided to acknowledge it. Whatever was happening clearly wanted my attention. I started speaking to it directly, calling it Albert. I'm not sure why I chose that name, but it felt right, and strangely enough, Albert seemed to enjoy it. After that, the strange activity settled down. The radios and printer didn't act up as often, and now I only occasionally feel his presence. When Albert does show up, it's subtle, like a cool, soft breeze brushing against me. I recently found out that the office building was built on the grounds of an old farm. Now I can't help but wonder if Albert once lived here and decided to stick around. He doesn't seem dangerous, just curious, maybe even a little playful. For now, we've made peace with each other. It's always been a strange time of year for me. My birthday falls on Halloween, and over the years, I've come to realize that odd things tend to happen around this time. It's like I'm caught in some kind of strange limbo between the living and the dead. These odd occurrences usually begin about a week before Halloween and linger for a week after. They're not always terrifying. Sometimes they're simply bizarre or even amusing, but they always leave me with a sense of unease that I can't shake. I've always felt like there's some kind of connection to the supernatural that follows me. It seems to intensify around my birthday. I never paid much attention to it until a few years ago when the pattern started to form in my mind. Now I try to be extra aware, as if the strange happenings are all part of some bigger picture. One memory, in particular, still stands out in my mind. It was Halloween, and I was preparing for my 12th birthday party. My parents were busy decorating the house, setting up for the celebration. That afternoon, I decided to take a walk to the corner store. On my way back, something unexpected happened. I was almost home when I saw it. A small white dog standing in front of the house next door. It wasn't barking, but instead, it stood there growling, watching me with a fierce expression as though it was guarding its territory. This tiny dog acted like it was 10 feet tall, completely fearless. I had to pass by it to get to my house, so I took slow, deliberate steps, keeping my eyes on it the entire time. It didn't move, but the tension in the air was palpable. When I finally got inside, I sighed in relief, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I didn't recognize the dog, and no one in the neighborhood seemed to own one like it. I figured it was a stray, just another random encounter to forget. But then the next Halloween rolled around, and something strange happened. On my birthday, I was walking home from the pharmacy when I saw it again, the same little white dog. It was standing on the sidewalk, growling at me as it had the year before. A full year had passed, and yet there it was. I stared at it for a long time, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. But once again, I didn't see it after that. It disappeared, just like it had the year before. This year, the weirdness started again. The Friday before my birthday, I got a strange call at work. A man named Jerry said I had left him a voicemail. He claimed it was my voice, but I had no memory of calling him. He asked me questions that seemed more personal than I was comfortable with. It felt wrong, like he knew too much about me. I wondered if it was just a prank, so I ignored it, but then he called again. He claimed he was a private investigator, but something about him didn't sit right. His voice sounded distant, almost too calm. I brushed it off as a random caller, but deep down, I felt something unsettling. Then Sunday rolled around. My husband and I had decided to hold off on turning on the heat until Thanksgiving. The weather had been chilly, but we figured we could make do with extra blankets. The next morning, I walked into the living room and was hit by the unmistakable scent of a heater that hadn't been turned on in months. The smell of dust burning off. I looked over at the thermostat. Sure enough, it was turned to a setting I knew we hadn't touched. My husband insisted he hadn't messed with it. I thought maybe he did it half asleep, but he swore he hadn't. It was one of those little things that made my stomach tighten. The weirdness continued. Monday morning came, and once again Jerry called. He asked me, out of the blue, what town I worked in. I was caught off guard and told him, half dazed from lack of sleep and without my morning coffee. The moment I hung up, I realized how wrong it was, how much information he had gathered. I felt exposed. That was the last time I heard from him, but the unease lingered. I shared the whole experience with my husband, and that's when he said something that stopped me cold. You know, you said weird things happen around Halloween every year. That's when it clicked. This wasn't new. It was a pattern. Every Halloween, without fail, something strange always happened. And then this morning, the last straw. A week had passed since my birthday, and I thought the weirdness was over. I was walking to my car, parked in the street, when I noticed a crumpled note tucked under my windshield wiper. I pulled it out, unfolding it carefully. It read, in bold capital letters, "Please do not park in dead-ass DRIVOAI again. Thanks." I felt confused and a little frustrated. I park in that spot all the time. No issues, no complaints. The house across the street belonged to a family my grandmother knew well. So why was someone leaving this note? Was it a prank from my Halloween visitors? Or was it something more? I'm not sure. As I stood there, pondering what to do, something told me that this wasn't from my neighbors. I haven't figured it out yet, but there's a part of me that feels like this Halloween, the strange visitors are still watching, waiting. I'll find out what happened soon enough. Until then, I'll keep my eyes open, because I know they're out there somewhere. Let me be clear. No matter what happened that day, I still don't believe in ghosts. I don't linger on the events, nor do I try to make sense of them. It's just one of those things that sticks with you, no matter how much you wish it wouldn't. When I was about 14, my family moved into a newly built house. It sat on land that used to be a creek bed, redirected decades earlier to make room for a man-made drainage ditch about 70 feet away. The land had history. A local legend claimed that settlers heading west in the 1800s often camped there. In fact, a few old artifacts were discovered when they developed the neighborhood. One summer evening, a few friends and I decided to head into the woods near our neighborhood, doing the usual dumb things teenage boys do. We'd been walking for about an hour when we suddenly heard the unmistakable sound of a child crying. It caught us off guard. At first, we thought maybe a kid had gotten lost or hurt, so we tried to follow the sound, calling out to see if anyone needed help. But it was strange. The crying kept moving. One minute it sounded like it was ahead of us, and the next it was behind us. We tried for a while, but eventually the crying stopped. We shrugged it off, figured it was just a stray animal, and went back home. A few days later, I decided to go back into the woods alone. I wasn't expecting anything strange, but as soon as I stepped in, I heard it again, the crying. This time I could make out words, a child's voice, faint but clear, calling for her mother. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I pushed the feeling aside. I thought maybe a kid really had gotten lost out here. But as before, the sound shifted, never staying in one spot. I called out, but there was no answer. Getting uneasy, I decided to head back and call the police. But then something stopped me cold. Across a small ravine to my left, I saw her. A young girl, standing there in the shadows, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. It reminded me of something out of a pioneer story. She was wearing a long dress, the kind I'd seen in old books, like the ones in Little House on the Prairie. She didn't move, just stood there staring at me. I called out to her, telling her to stay where she was and that I'd come help. She didn't respond, didn't even flinch. My stomach turned, and I scrambled down the ravine. I crossed it as quickly as I could and climbed up to where she had been. But when I reached the spot, nothing. She was gone. I called out for her, looked around, but there was no sign. Finally, feeling uneasy and more than a little frustrated, I went home and told my parents. They helped me call the police. The police took my statement and searched the area for a while, but they didn't find anything. They told us no missing child reports had been filed and suggested it might have been a local kid who got scared and ran off. But I wasn't convinced. Over the next few months, more people from the neighborhood started talking about hearing a child crying in the woods. Like me, none of them could find where the sound was coming from. 3 years later, construction crews started clearing out the woods to make room for the next phase of development. One day, while digging, the crew came across something strange. A stone slate with crude words carved into it. Aurophilia. Rip. Beneath the stone, they uncovered a skeleton, wearing clothes just like the ones I'd seen on that girl. The police were called, and after some investigation, they determined the remains belonged to a girl from the 1800s, back when wagon trains passed through the area. Who she was or how she ended up there is still a mystery. The discovery made the local paper, and eventually, the remains were moved to a cemetery for proper burial. To this day, I still don't know if the girl I saw that summer was the same one buried under that slate, or if she was the one crying in the woods. I don't believe in ghosts, but even now, just thinking about it gives me chills. When I was 9, I had to undergo surgery for a hernia. The physical pain from the incision was tough, and the lingering limp on my left side was a constant reminder of it. But what really hurt the most wasn't the physical discomfort. It was the teasing I received from my own family. It was around the time that Weird Al Yankovic's Living with a Hernia had just hit the airwaves. My sisters, who couldn't resist a joke, sang that song every time they passed by me. But the worst part of it all was my grandmother. At the time, I had no idea she was battling lung cancer, or that she'd recently had part of her left lung removed. She'd show us her long incision, running from her belly button to her spine, and make a joke out of it, limping around the house for effect. My sisters laughed hysterically, mimicking her exaggerated steps, but all I could feel was a deep sense of anger. I hated that she was laughing at me, especially since I had no idea what she was going through. From that day on, I silently resented her. I never let on how much it bothered me, but I found small ways to get back at her. One of my little rebellions was setting the dinner table. Every night, I made sure she got the oldest, most worn-out plates and silverware we had. It was my way of showing my frustration, though I thought no one noticed. But I was wrong. 7 months later, my grandmother passed away in our living room, which we transformed into a bedroom for her last days. That room, now closed off behind shutter doors, carried a heavy presence that I couldn't shake. The night of her funeral, I came down with food poisoning and spent the whole night tossing and turning. At one point, I glanced down the hallway and froze. A thick mist hovered near my bedroom door, shifting in the dim light. I was terrified. I quickly shut my eyes, pulling the covers tightly over my head, hoping it would go away. But that night wasn't the end. Over the next few weeks and months, strange things began happening. One evening, I overheard my mother talking to my dad about some missing plates, cups, and silverware. She swore she hadn't moved them, but my dad just shrugged it off, telling her she must have misplaced them. I said nothing, but that conversation sent a chill through me. A few months later, I moved into a bedroom closer to the room we now called the death room. The hallway at night felt eerie, and the shutter doors would often be left slightly ajar. One night, I glanced toward them and saw a figure standing in the crack of the door. It was dark, its shape undefined, but its piercing green eyes stood out. They seemed to burn right through me. I felt its gaze as if it was pressing down on my chest. Frozen in fear, I turned over and squeezed my eyes shut, but I could still feel it watching me. The following summer, we moved to a bigger house in the same town. I was relieved to leave that old house behind, hoping whatever had been lingering there wouldn't follow us. For a while, things were calm, until one day, when my sisters and I came home from school. We were alone when the phone rang. We rushed to answer it, but as we reached the doorway to the room where the phone sat, we all froze. The phone, sitting flat on the table, lifted off the surface. It hovered for a moment in midair before dropping to the floor with a loud thud, landing right at our feet. We stood there, staring at it, too frightened to move. My older sister, who had seen the whole thing, still refuses to talk about it to this day. When our mom got home, we told her what had happened. She didn't seem surprised at all. Instead, she shrugged and said, "Maybe Nana came to visit." Her words lingered with me, and even now, I'm still unsure how to feel about what happened in that house, or what followed us to the next one. Whether it was my grandmother's spirit or something else entirely, the experiences left a mark I'll never forget. Hey everyone, I put a lot of effort and heart into creating these videos just for you. If you're enjoying the content, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a quick comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Your support means the world to me, and it keeps me motivated to bring more awesome videos your way. In the late 1980s, when I was around 9 years old, my mom and I moved into an old farmhouse in rural southern Ohio. The house, with its cracked and faded exterior, had a serious, almost imposing look. Inside, though, there were charming touches: push-button light switches, tall windows with wide sills, and detailed woodwork that added character. The pantry was the standout feature, large, with porcelain-handled drawers and spacious cupboards perfect for all sorts of food and kitchen items. We settled in as renters, just the two of us at first. Mom's boyfriend, Scott, a friendly and easygoing man, often came to visit. I didn't mind the house, though it wasn't long before I started noticing odd things. One afternoon, I returned home from school, hungry for a snack, and went straight for the pantry. As I grabbed a box of cereal, I heard the distinct clinking of dishes coming from the enclosed back porch. Thinking Mom was out there unpacking, I opened the door to investigate, but when I stepped inside, there was nothing, just a dusty heater, a pair of old rubber boots, and the late afternoon sunlight pouring through the windows. I brushed it off as just the creaky noises of an old house and continued with my snack. Later that month, I was sitting at the kitchen table, doing homework while Mom unpacked groceries. Suddenly, the light fixture above me fell from the ceiling. It should have shattered, but it didn't. The glass shade remained completely intact despite falling 6 feet. We were both shaken, but we cleaned it up and put it back in place. It didn't give us any more trouble after that. But the strange happenings didn't stop. One rainy afternoon, I distinctly heard the sound of footsteps thumping on the wooden boards we laid outside to keep from stepping in the mud. Thinking it was Scott, I ran to the door, shouting, "Scott's here." But when I opened it, no one was there. His car wasn't in the driveway either. Mom, coming downstairs with a towel around her hair, raised an eyebrow when I told her. Was all she said. Then about 20 minutes later, Scott arrived, leaving me to wonder just who, or what, I'd heard. And then there was the unnerving sensation of being watched. From the kitchen, it always felt like someone was standing just outside the east windows, near the old lilac bush. Both Mom and I felt it, though we never saw anything, and the feeling lingered like a constant shadow. The footsteps inside the house were even harder to ignore. One evening, Mom told me she'd been taking a bath when she heard heavy boots climbing the stairs. The footsteps stopped just outside the bathroom door. She called out, thinking it was Scott, but there was no answer. Feeling uneasy, she got out, wrapped herself in a robe, and opened the door. There was no one there. The floors were bare, so any movement should have been audible, but everything was silent. That's when I told her about hearing the dishes clink on the porch. "That's strange," she said, explaining that the previous owner had mentioned the porch used to be a summer kitchen. Over time, we started to acknowledge the house's strange energy. We'd hear the heavy booted footsteps going up the stairs again and again, but never coming down. A second, lighter set of footsteps, like a woman's, would join the man's, as though someone was walking alongside him. Despite the eeriness, I didn't often feel scared. Mom was open about it, and her calm demeanor made the experiences feel less frightening. But one night, things took a turn. I woke up feeling sick and went to bed early, leaving Mom and Scott downstairs. Later, I woke to see Mom standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the hallway light. She came over, tucked the blankets around me, and touched my cheek. I was too tired to speak but appreciated the gesture. The next morning, when I thanked her, she gave me a strange look. "I didn't come upstairs," she said. After a pause, she admitted that while she had wanted to check on me, she'd felt something on the stairs that stopped her. We wondered if she had projected herself to me in some way, or maybe it was someone, or something, else watching over me. Years later, after Mom and Scott married, they bought the house. By then, I was in college. One summer, they offered me an upstairs room to use as an art studio. Thinking my childhood memories had been exaggerated, I agreed. I spent the day painting the room, even designing a colorful floral pattern on the floor. As evening fell, I felt the first chill of discomfort, even though the August night was warm. A sense of unease crept over me as I continued my work. That's when I saw it, a shadow cast under the door. The light was behind me, and the shadow should have been cast the other way. But there it was. It looked like the outline of feet, but the longer I stared, the more it seemed to solidify. Panic surged through me. I couldn't bring myself to approach the door. Instead, I scrambled out the window onto the roof of the old summer kitchen and jumped down to the ground. I ran down the road, not stopping until I felt safe. Later, I returned with Mom to lock up the house. The upstairs was calm again, but the door to my room, one I had left shut, was now wide open. Looking back, I wonder, was the house angry about the changes I'd made to the room? Or was I simply witnessing something that had been there all along, hiding in the shadows? The shadow I saw felt different from the booted man we'd often heard. It was quiet, far more chilling than any sound of footsteps. It lingered in the silence, making my skin crawl. I never went back to the house after that summer, but the thoughts of it still linger, and I can't shake the feeling that the unseen inhabitants of that house are still walking its halls. I usually tell people I don't believe in ghosts. Honestly, I try very hard not to believe in them, but what I don't often share is that I'm being haunted. It all started when I was a university student in rural Texas. One night, my brother, my close friend Sarah, and I decided to take a late-night walk across campus. It was unseasonably cold, and a biting wind cut through the air. We sought shelter between the stone columns of an old, covered walkway, huddling together for warmth. While my brother and Sarah talked, my mind began to drift. I felt detached, as if my thoughts were floating far away from the present moment. Then, something strange happened. It was as though I wasn't sitting beneath the walkway anymore. Instead, I was standing 100 yards away, looking back at the three of us. Suddenly, I felt like I was soaring down the corridor, racing toward us, the stone pillars blurring as I sped forward. The sensation ended just as abruptly as it had begun, leaving me dizzy and confused. I looked back down the corridor, and, in a daze, I heard myself speak. "Hey, do you see something down there?" We turned and looked. At first, it was just a vague shape, unclear, uncertain. But as we kept talking, we began to describe what we were seeing, piecing together the details. It looked like a man, but he was gray, featureless, running toward us down the corridor. His arms flailed above his head in a jerky, unnatural way. He only ran about 30 feet before he faded into nothing, then reappeared where he had started, repeating the same eerie loop. We stood there, transfixed, watching it for more than an hour. Oddly, none of us felt afraid. There was an overwhelming sense of emptiness, a deep, hollow longing radiating from the figure. When we tried to approach it, it vanished the moment we got too close, only to reappear when we stepped back. Eventually, it disappeared entirely, and we walked back to our dorms, unsettled but not terrified. A few nights later, I had a nightmare. I dreamed I was awake in my bed, and the ghost from the corridor emerged from my closet. A cold dread washed over me as it floated toward me, a heavy, lifeless presence that seemed to suck the air from the room. In my dream, I pulled the covers tighter around me, thinking they would protect me. But the thing rose into the air, hovered above me, and then slipped under the covers, settling behind me. I could feel it there, pressing against my back, and then came a sharp, startling sensation, like being punched. In an instant, the dream shifted. Suddenly, I was sitting in the science hall, listening to a biology lecture. I turned to my friend Sarah in the dream and said, "Hey, you want to see something interesting?" In the dream, I led her to the same corridor and showed her the running ghost. But this time, it wasn't just strange, it was filled with an unbearable grief, a longing so intense it gnawed at my soul. Its sorrow became my sorrow. Then it opened its mouth, and I opened mine, and its voice poured out through my lips, a distorted, mournful wail that echoed down the corridor. I woke up to my brother shaking me, his face pale with worry. He told me I had been screaming in my sleep, an otherworldly, horrible sound that had startled him awake. I never saw the ghost again, not in the waking world. Once, I thought I glimpsed a dark shadow darting past, but I couldn't tell if it was real or just my imagination. The dreams, though, they stayed. They were always different, yet always the same. In every dream, I'm being chased by something I can't see, something that feels malevolent. And always, there's the wailing. The worst dreams are the ones where I think I'm awake. In those dreams, the line between the real and the unreal blurs, and even now, the memory of them feels almost unbearable. Over time, the dreams became less frequent, fading with the passing years. Now, more than 12 years later, they come only a few times a year. I've tried to make peace with this ghost I don't believe in. Sometimes I talk to it. I tell it that when I die, it can follow me. I don't think it's evil, just lost, caught in an unending cycle of grief. But then there are the dreams, and in those moments, the haunting feels all too real, and the fear is impossible to ignore. It was just a typical summer day in our small town of Pine Lake. The air was thick with humidity, and the smell of sizzling burgers filled the backyard as we gathered for my 19th birthday barbecue. We were surrounded by friends and family, the kind of celebration that made you forget the weight of everyday life. But something happened that day, something that still haunts me. My Aunt Meg, 45, had always been healthy despite living with diabetes. She took care of herself, always cautious about managing her blood sugar. That day, she was setting the table when, without warning, she collapsed. I was walking toward her to help when I froze, unsure of what was happening. One moment, she was fine, and the next, she was lying still, her eyes closed. My heart pounded as I shouted, "Mom." Panic surged through me as my mom and another aunt rushed to her side. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Aunt Meg was unconscious, and someone called an ambulance. In the minutes that followed, I couldn't help but feel a chill crawl up my spine. Seeing her lying there, lifeless, was the most terrifying experience of my life. I couldn't stop crying, my chest tightening with fear. The paramedics arrived quickly, working furiously to stabilize her, and rushed her to the hospital. But before we even reached the ER, the phone rang. The news that followed left me paralyzed. Aunt Meg had passed away. The doctors said her blood sugar dropped too low, causing her body to shut down. It didn't make sense. Aunt Meg had always been meticulous about her health, never letting diabetes control her life. The shock of losing her hit us all hard, leaving us numb, as if we were trapped in some nightmare. When we returned home from the hospital, My dad stayed back to make some calls while the rest of us tried to process what had just happened. Then the phone rang again. It was the hospital, and my dad's face went pale as he spoke. When he hung up, he delivered news that none of us were prepared for. Aunt Meg was alive. The weight lifted off my chest, and I broke down, tears of relief flooding my face. We rushed back to the hospital, hearts racing, only to be told we couldn't see her immediately. As we waited in a sterile, cold room, we learned what had really happened. On the way to the morgue, the attendants heard faint moans coming from inside the body bag. They opened it, and to their shock, Aunt Meg was crying, alive. Later, when we finally saw her, she lay in a hospital bed, her face damp with tears. My mom and other aunts embraced her, their sobs mingling with hers. I stood at the foot of the bed, still processing the impossible. Aunt Meg's eyes were wide with disbelief, but she was alive. She told us what she experienced during those 19 minutes when she was clinically dead. She explained that, after collapsing, she felt an intense, sharp pain shoot through her body. Then everything went dark. The pain vanished, and she felt weightless, neither heavy nor light. It was as if she were floating in a void. The next thing she knew, she wasn't breathing. Everything around her had an eerie, glowing white hue. And there, standing before her, was my grandmother, who had passed away 2 years earlier. My grandmother reached out and hugged Aunt Meg tightly, filling her with an overwhelming sense of love, peace, and warmth. My grandmother whispered, "It's not your time yet." Aunt Meg said that, in that moment, she felt the deepest sense of comfort and calm she had ever known. Before she let go, my grandmother said, "Tell Matt I wish him luck for me, and don't worry. I'll see you again, my love." Then everything went dark once again. Aunt Meg felt her breath return, her body heavy, and she could hear voices around her. That's when she realized she was in the body bag crying out. Someone opened it, and the rest of us stood in disbelief. What shook me the most was that my grandmother had mentioned me by name and wished me luck. The thing is, that day was my 19th birthday, and Aunt Meg had been dead for exactly 19 minutes. I still don't know what to make of it. Why did my grandmother specifically ask to wish me luck? I still find myself thinking about it. Since that day, Aunt Meg has made a full recovery. She's healthier than ever, and she says that her near-death experience changed her. It's as if the love and peace she felt during those moments gave her a new perspective on life. She says that anything is possible now, and that the fear she once had about her condition no longer holds power over her. For me, that day left a deep mark on my soul. I'm closer to Aunt Meg than ever before, and I can't imagine what life would have been like if we had lost her. Her story reminds me that life is fragile, yet full of mysteries that we may never truly understand. I've always been close to my dad. As his youngest child and second daughter, he made up his mind early on. If he couldn't have a son, he'd make sure he raised a tomboy. I spent my childhood out hunting and fishing with him, and we played baseball and football together. For the longest time, I wanted to be a boy, but that changed when I hit my teenage years. Once the hormones kicked in, I started seeing the boys around me in a new light. Suddenly, being a tomboy wasn't as much fun as being a girl. While my dad and I had a bond that could never be broken, my relationship with my mom was a lot more complicated. We were like oil and water. No matter how hard we tried, we just couldn't mix. I loved her, but our personalities clashed constantly. My dad worried about this often. He worked hard to bring us together, trying to smooth over the arguments, making sure we didn't stay upset with each other for too long. As time passed, I grew up, got married, and had 2 sons of my own. My dad couldn't have been happier. He finally had a son-in-law who became his best friend, and 2 grandsons he could teach to hunt and fish with. For him, life was perfect. Dad retired at 62, still in great health. He spent his retirement enjoying the farm, where there was always something to do. For 16 wonderful years, he lived a life filled with family and joy. When he passed away, it was exactly how he'd always wanted, peacefully in his sleep. One moment he was there, and the next, he was gone. Even though it was the peaceful passing he had always hoped for, losing him hit me harder than I expected. None of us were ready to say goodbye. For days after his funeral, I couldn't sleep. I'd wander around the house at night, unable to find any peace. I tried lying down, but I couldn't stay still. The grief was all-consuming. 5 days after the funeral, I finally managed to fall asleep on the couch in our den one afternoon. When I woke up, I saw him. My dad was sitting right in front of me on the coffee table. He wasn't a shadow or a memory. He was as real as anything I'd ever seen. He just sat there staring at me. When I sat up, he spoke. "Honey, if you loved me, be good to your mother," he said. Then, just like that, he vanished. I know what I saw. No one can convince me otherwise. Afterward, I called my mom to tell her what happened. The moment she picked up the phone, something shifted inside me. All the arguments, all the misunderstandings, they suddenly didn't matter anymore. From that day forward, my mom and I became closer than I ever thought possible. It was like my dad's message was the bridge we needed to heal. 6 months later, I had a dream about my dad. In the dream, he told me, "I was there. Look at the table." I woke up in the middle of the night, and I went downstairs to check the coffee table where he'd been sitting. On that side of the table, the wood looked different. It had fine lines, almost as though it had cracked. I had never noticed it before, and the rest of the table was still smooth, untouched. That coffee table isn't just furniture anymore. It's a part of him, a symbol of his love and his final message to me. It'll never leave this house. To me, it's my dad's resting place, a spot where his presence will always remain. Some time ago, I attended a family gathering with friends and relatives at my cousin's house in a small town in the Midwest. Like many gatherings, the men gathered in one room while the women were in another. The evening was filled with lively discussions about politics, the economy, and the occasional joke to keep things light. But as the night went on, the conversation shifted, this time to ghosts and the supernatural. We took turns sharing stories. Some we'd experienced ourselves, others we had only heard. But there was one story that stood out, told by an older man we'll call Jim. He was a local from up north, someone we always respected, but he had an unsettling tale from his teenage years. Back then, Jim's family lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by acres of woods. His father had a small woodlot that they used to gather firewood, especially with winter fast approaching. The cold was starting to bite at the edges of the day, and there was still work to be done before the snow came. One crisp autumn afternoon, Jim and his father loaded up the old pickup truck with axes and chainsaws, ready to head into the woods. They took along their faithful dog, Scout, a golden retriever who was always by their side. Scout hopped eagerly into the back of the truck, his tail wagging in excitement. Jim's mother stayed behind, busy with chores around the house while the men headed out. The road to their cutting site was a rough dirt path, filled with ruts and sharp turns, bordered by thick forest. It wasn't a road for careless driving, but Jim's father knew it well. They traveled it for years. But just after they left, something odd happened. Jim's mother was in the kitchen when she heard Scout barking outside, but it wasn't the usual happy bark. This bark was frantic, urgent. When she stepped out onto the porch, she saw him running back and forth, barking in a strange, almost desperate manner. He'd run a few yards down the road, then stop and look back, urging her to follow. Reluctantly, she decided to trust the dog and followed him down the dirt road. Scout led her deep into the woods, his barking echoing in the air. At every turn, he stopped to make sure she was still there, then continued on his path. When they reached a bend in the road, her blood ran cold. There in front of her was the truck, flipped upside down, the metal crumpled in a way that didn't seem possible. She rushed to the wreck, heart racing. Her mind was a blur, but she was relieved to see both Jim and his father struggling to crawl out from beneath the overturned truck. They were bruised, shaken, but miraculously alive. As Jim's mother moved to help them, she glanced down at the back of the truck and saw something that made her freeze, a pool of blood and fur beneath the crumpled truck bed. Scout, the loyal dog, was crushed beneath the wreckage. Her heart broke as the full weight of the moment sank in. Scout had been with them when the truck flipped. But then came the strangest part. As she stood there, tears in her eyes, she turned around to look for Scout. The dog who had led her to this moment, who had saved their lives, he was gone, without a trace. Scout had disappeared. The next day, after the truck was removed, Jim's father buried Scout beneath an old oak tree on their land, the same tree where they had played fetch for years, where Scout had spent countless hours by Jim's side. It was a quiet, solemn place, a final resting spot for the dog who had been more family than pet. To this day, Jim still talks about the sacrifice Scout made, the way he led his mother down that rough road, guiding her through the darkness, ensuring they would survive. It was as if Scout's love for the family was so strong that it transcended death. A dog's final act of loyalty, a love that didn't fade even after he was gone. It's one thing to be frightened by a ghost, but it's a whole different experience when they want your baby. This happened to me and my oldest son back in 1981. If you're reading this late at night, you might want to turn on some lights. At the time, my oldest was 18 months old, and my wife, now my ex-wife, was pregnant with our second child. We lived in a small, secluded cabin down a narrow dirt road, about 100 yards from the main house. Nestled deep in the woods of North Carolina, the cabin was surrounded by towering pine trees, and the isolation of the place always made me uneasy. The woods behind the house seemed to stretch on forever, and sometimes, while I was working out back, I felt like something, or someone, was watching me. That feeling of dread would come over me without warning, and I never let my son play outside alone. When my wife went into labor, we dropped our son off at my mother-in-law's place and rushed to the hospital. It was a long, grueling delivery, but after 22 hours, we welcomed a healthy baby boy into the world. By the time we got back to the cabin, I hadn't slept for nearly 2 days. Exhausted, I collapsed into bed, hoping for a few hours of rest. That's when I heard it, laughter. The sound of men laughing outside my bedroom door, like they were in the middle of some conversation, joking around. It sounded so real, so close. I'm from Chicago, and I always kept a baseball bat by the bed for protection. I grabbed it and rushed out, ready to face whatever was there. But the house was silent. The air felt thick and heavy, and a chill ran down my spine. I felt like I wasn't alone, like something was there with me watching. I checked every room, inside and out, but found nothing. Convinced I'd just been dreaming, I went back to bed. But just as I started to drift off again, I heard the sound of water running in the bathroom. I jumped up, bat in hand, and rushed in. Once again, the room was empty, but both faucets were wide open, water pouring into the tub. I turned them off, but that same eerie feeling washed over me again. This time, there was a faint, unmistakable smell of baby shampoo in the air. At this point, I was spooked. I turned on every light in the house and searched it thoroughly again, but everything was just as I'd left it. I tried to calm myself by turning on the TV, but it was just after midnight, and the only thing I could get was the national anthem. This was back when stations would go off the air. I tried the radio, but all I got was static. In the end, I couldn't sleep, so I spent the rest of the night on the couch, bat in hand, the lights on, my nerves shot. The next morning, when sunlight filtered through the windows, I started to wonder if I had imagined it all. But then I saw the desk where I'd slept the night before. It was a simple wooden thing, and every drawer had been turned around so the handles were facing inward. A cold shiver ran through me, and that feeling of dread came rushing back. I packed up as quickly as I could and took my son to my mother-in-law's house. We returned a few days later, hoping everything would be back to normal. I didn't tell my wife about what had happened. I didn't want to scare her or worry her too much. The first night back, everything seemed fine. I finally fell asleep, hoping it was all behind me. But then, in the middle of the night, my wife woke me up. "Do you hear the water running?" she whispered. My heart dropped. I jumped out of bed, and sure enough, both faucets were blasting water into the tub again. That same feeling of dread settled over me, The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and the smell of baby shampoo lingered in the air. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just some random thing. Whatever this was, it wanted our baby. I rushed to the nursery, grabbed our newborn, and yelled to my wife, "Get dressed. We're leaving now." She quickly packed, and I grabbed our oldest. We were out of there faster than I thought possible. On the drive to her mom's house, I finally told her everything that had happened. She was just as shaken as I was. We never stayed in that house again. I only went back during the day to pack and clean up, always keeping the water shut off, the lights on, and the radio playing. Before we left for good, I told the landlord why we were moving. He just nodded, almost like he knew. Then he told me a story about the woman who had lived there before us. She had been known to party, have men over all the time, but once she got pregnant, she stopped all of that. She had a baby boy, but not long after, the baby drowned in the tub. The police never officially proved it wasn't an accident, but the landlord was convinced she had killed her son to get her old life back. Without hesitation, he refunded my deposit. Even after we moved, every time I drove past that house, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. I didn't tell my son about any of this until he was in his late teens. When I did, he didn't believe me at first, thinking I was just telling a spooky story. When his mom confirmed it, though, he was silent, just staring at me, creeped out. To this day, it still bothers me. Some things you never forget. And that house? I don't think it's ever truly empty.